The operating room had gone completely still. Not the controlled stillness of a focused surgical team, the frozen, airless kind. The kind that happens when something has gone wrong and nobody wants to be the first to say it. The patient on table 3, a 40-year-old man who had arrived unconscious from a highway wreck, suddenly opened his eyes. His lips moved. The circulating nurse leaned close, straining to hear. "Don't let her leave," he whispered. "The one who held my hand. Don't let her go." Nobody understood what he meant. Then the windows rattled. Then the walls. A deep mechanical thunder rolled across the city of Harlow Falls from somewhere above the clouds. The unmistakable sound of military helicopters arriving before anyone inside Meridian General Hospital had any idea why. If this story already has you locked in, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Hit like, follow the channel, and don't move. Because what happens next inside these walls is going to shake everything you thought you knew about who really saves lives. Emily Voss arrived at Meridian General on a Tuesday morning in February with 2 things: a single duffel bag and a hospital ID badge that still had the laminate film half peeled at the corner. She had printed it herself. That detail would have mattered to someone paying attention. Nobody was paying attention. The charge nurse, Donna Price, barely looked up from the scheduling board when Emily presented herself at the 3rd-floor nursing station. Donna was a tall woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses she never actually wore on her face, instead using them as a prop, held in one hand and pointed at things like a conductor's baton when she wanted to make a point. "Float pool?" Donna asked, though the question had no real curiosity in it. "Permanent hire," Emily said. "Trauma and surgical floor. Start date was pushed from last week," HR said to report directly. "I know what HR said." Donna finally looked at her, a brief, comprehensive scan that took in Emily's slight frame, her unadorned scrubs, her calm face, and found all of it wanting. "You've worked trauma before?" "Yes." "Where?" Emily paused for exactly 1 beat. "Various placements." Donna's expression said she had heard that answer before, and from people who had no business working a trauma floor. She handed Emily a laminated sheet, the unit orientation checklist, without another word and turned back to the board. Emily took the sheet, glanced at it once, and set it on the counter. She had memorized its contents in about 4 seconds. She had written similar checklists before, in different contexts, for different purposes, and the core of every one was the same. Know your equipment, know your team, know your exits. She picked up a set of vitals charts and started her rounds. What? The surgical floor at Meridian General was the kind of unit that had once been well run and wasn't anymore. You could see it in the small things. Medication carts that had wheels slightly off true, so they always drifted left when pushed, and nobody had filed the maintenance request. A whiteboard in the staff corridor with 3 different staff meeting schedules posted, 2 of them outdated, none of them marked clearly. Supply closets organized by someone who had long since left, reorganized by whoever was next, and now arranged by neither system and halfway between both. A unit that had once had standards and had slowly, incrementally stopped enforcing them. Emily cataloged all of it on her first walkthrough and said nothing. What she did say on that first day was something she would later be told she should have kept to herself. The patient in room 318 was a 63-year-old man named Wallace Greer, post-op from a gallbladder removal, recovering without complication according to his chart. He was a quiet man with a gray beard and calloused hands who thanked every nurse who came in to check on him, regardless of how briefly they stayed. Emily checked his chart, then checked him. Actually checked him, pulling the blanket back to look at his abdomen, pressing with 2 fingers at 3 points along his right flank, watching his face while she did it. He winced at the second press. Not dramatically, the way a person winces when they're trying not to. "Has anyone talked to you about your pain level since this morning?" she asked. "The doctor came by around 9, Wallace said. Said everything looked good. Did you tell him it hurt when they pressed here?" A pause. "I didn't want to make a fuss." Emily looked at the drainage output in the log sheet. Slightly elevated, but within the documented acceptable range. The attending had signed off at 9:14 a.m. It was now 2:47 p.m., and the output trend over the intervening hours, when she graphed it in her head, was not acceptable. She flagged the chart for attending review and wrote a clinical note. Patient demonstrating localized guarding on right flank. Pain response inconsistent with post-operative day 2 profile. Recommend abdominal reassessment and possible imaging. The attending was Dr. Marcus Thorne. She did not yet know that flagging a chart for Dr. Marcus Thorne's review was the specific action most likely to make the rest of her time at Meridian General miserable. So she found out within the hour. Thorne was 51, board-certified in general surgery and trauma, and operated with the absolute assurance of a man who had been the smartest person in every room he'd entered for approximately the last 2 decades. He was not entirely wrong about this assessment of himself. He was also not entirely right. He came to the nursing station holding Emily's chart flag like it was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "Who wrote this note?" he asked the room at large. Donna looked up. "New hire. Float from—" "I'm here," Emily said from 2 feet away. Thorne turned. He was 6 feet tall and used the height consciously, the way some men do. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man recalibrating downward. "You're the one who flagged Greer." "Yes." "His chart is clean. Post-op day 2, vitals stable, output within range. What exactly is your concern?" Emily kept her voice level and specific. "His drainage trend has shifted in the last 4 hours. The absolute numbers are within documented range, but the slope is wrong. It should be decreasing by now, and it's not. He's also guarding at the right flank in a pattern that doesn't match where his incision pain should be concentrating on day 2. I think there may be a small bile leak that didn't present on the post-op imaging." A silence. Thorne smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't a smile. A bile leak. "It's possible. I could be wrong. But I think it warrants—" "You've been on this floor for how long? 4 hours?" "About 5. And in 5 hours, you've diagnosed something 3 surgeons and 2 senior nurses missed." "I didn't say diagnosed. I said it warrants a second look." Thorne set the chart down on the counter. He did it slowly, which was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take this note out of his chart because a clinical flag with this level of speculation attached to it is a liability document, not a medical recommendation. And you're going to spend the rest of your shift doing what new nurses do, which is learning this floor, not reinterpreting charts that experienced physicians have already reviewed." Emily said nothing for a moment. "I'd like the note to stay in the chart," she said. Something shifted in Thorne's expression. Not anger, not yet. More like the moment before anger, when a person is deciding whether to bother. "Excuse me?" "If I'm wrong, the note is irrelevant and can be addressed in my file. If I'm right, it creates a timeline. I'd like it to stay." Thorne picked the chart back up, found the page, and drew a single line through Emily's notation. Not a proper administrative amendment, just a line. Then he handed it back to Donna without looking at Emily again. "Stay in your lane," he said, and walked back toward the surgical wing. Donna watched him go, then looked at Emily. Her expression was not unkind exactly, more like someone watching a car merge into traffic from an on-ramp without checking their mirrors. "He's not going to forget that," Donna said quietly. "I know," Emily said, and went back to her rounds. At 7:40 p.m., Wallace Greer's drain output spiked. The night nurse, a young man named Preston Okafor, who had only been on the floor 6 months, caught it during vitals and called it in. By 8:15, the imaging showed a small but confirmed bile leak at the anastomotic site. By 9, Wallace was back in the OR for a repair procedure that, caught at this stage, took 40 minutes and would not complicate his recovery. Emily was not on shift anymore. She had clocked out at 7, changed in the locker room, and was eating a sandwich in her car in the parking garage when her phone showed the unit page log. She still had access as the flagging nurse, a technical detail the system hadn't revoked yet. She read the update, finished her sandwich, and drove to her apartment. She did not tell anyone she had read it. The next morning, she arrived to find that Dr. Thorne had documented Wallace Greer's bile leak as an unexpected post-operative finding identified during routine monitoring. The credit for early detection had gone, in the official paperwork, to the night team. No mention of a chart flag. No mention of a clinical note that had been crossed out. Donna saw Emily read the documentation. Something passed across the charge nurse's face. Not guilt, not sympathy either. More like a reminder to herself of something she had already known. "That's how it goes here," Donna said. not as an apology, more like a weather report. Emily nodded. She had heard variations of that sentence in worse places than this. The first week accumulated like sediment. There was the morning Thorne reviewed a patient transfer in the corridor and referred to Emily, in front of 4 staff members, as the one with the diagnostic hobby. There was the afternoon Donna assigned her exclusively to administrative documentation tasks, charting, supply audits, shift summaries, for an entire 8-hour shift, work that required 0 clinical skill and kept her away from patients entirely. There was the incident with the crash cart. A patient on the 4th floor, cardiac floor, not Emily's unit, went into ventricular fibrillation during an afternoon visit from family. The code team responded. Emily happened to be in the corridor returning a borrowed portable monitor, saw the crash cart being wheeled past, and noticed immediately that the defibrillator's electrode pads were in the wrong storage slot. The adult pads were in the pediatric position, and vice versa. It was the kind of thing that took 3 seconds to swap. She swapped them without breaking stride and kept moving. She didn't know that a second-year resident named Dr. Farida Osei had watched her do it, or that Farida would later describe what she'd seen to 2 other residents in terms that were quietly admiring. Emily didn't know that either. What Emily did know was that she was watching this hospital with the focused attention of someone who had learned a long time ago that the difference between a unit that worked and one that didn't was almost never about equipment or funding. It was about whether the people running it believed they were accountable to anything outside their own authority. Meridian General had a problem with that belief. Or rather, it had a problem with the absence of that belief, and the problem ran in a specific direction, upward, toward Dr. Marcus Thorne, who set the tone for the surgical floor with the casual certainty of someone who had never been seriously wrong in a way that cost him anything. Emily had seen this pattern before, in different settings, under different pressures. She knew how it ended. 9 days into her assignment, Donna scheduled her off the trauma rotation entirely, reassigning her to the rehabilitation wing, a move that was technically within Donna's discretion as charge nurse and practically removed Emily from any situation where her clinical judgment might again intersect with Thorne's. The rehabilitation wing was quiet. Long days. Patients recovering from hip replacements and stroke rehabilitation, steady and slow, nothing acute. Emily did the work without complaint and did it well, because she did everything well, and the patients responded to her with the uncomplicated gratitude of people in pain who are being treated with genuine care. But she watched the trauma floor from a distance. She read the unit logs. She tracked the patterns. On day 11, she went to Donna during a shift overlap. The trauma unit has had 3 patients this week whose imaging was delayed by more than 4 hours from initial presentation, she said. 2 of them had outcomes that might have been different with faster imaging. I want to flag it for... You're on rehab rotation, Donna said. I know. I'm flagging it as a staff member, not as the attending clinician. Flag it to your unit supervisor. You're my unit supervisor. Donna looked at her for a long moment. There was something behind her eyes that Emily could almost read. A conflict between what Donna knew was right and what Donna understood to be survivable in this particular environment. Emily, Donna's voice dropped, not unkind. I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. Thorne has already talked to HR about your performance. He's characterizing you as a disruptive presence. If you keep pushing, has anyone reviewed the imaging delay logs? A pause. No. Then I'm going to document it in writing and route it through incident reporting. That will go directly to Thorne's administrative queue. I know. Donna looked at her with something that might have been, in another life, a kind of admiration. You have no idea how this place works, do you? Emily said nothing, which was its own answer. She filed the incident report that afternoon. 3 imaging delays, documented with timestamps, patient ID numbers, and outcome correlations. Professional, specific, irrefutable. Thorne's response came the next morning. A formal written reprimand in Emily's personnel file for unauthorized escalation of administrative concerns outside appropriate chain of command, citing her as a new employee who had repeatedly demonstrated inability to adapt to unit culture and institutional processes. Emily read it in the break room. She folded it in half and put it in her bag. She poured a cup of coffee. The machine on this floor made it too weak, something else nobody had fixed, and stood at the window for a moment, watching the parking lot below where ambulances idled between calls. She thought, not for the first time, that this evaluation was going to be over sooner than anyone here expected. She also thought that it needed to finish the way it was supposed to finish, with evidence, not speculation, with documentation, not impression, with everything on the record so that nothing could be dismissed later. She drank her coffee. She went back to work. On the 14th day, the highway happened. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray February day where the light was thin and pale and the roads were wet from the morning's rain. 17 miles outside Harlow Falls, a semi-trailer jackknifed on the interstate overpass, and the chain of impacts that followed involved 11 vehicles and took approximately 40 seconds from first collision to last. The first ambulance called it in at 2:23 p.m. By 2:45, Meridian General's emergency department had received its initial alert, mass casualty incident. Estimated 15 to 20 patients inbound, severity range critical to moderate. The trauma floor was placed on standby. Every available body was called in. Emily was in the rehabilitation wing completing afternoon vital checks when the overhead announcement came. She finished the vital check she was in the middle of, patient first, announcement second, and then walked directly to the trauma floor without waiting to be called. Some things you did not need to be asked twice. The ER was already controlled chaos when she arrived. Gurneys in motion, gloves snapping, voices layered over each other in the compressed functional shorthand of trauma teams who had trained for exactly this. It was the kind of scene that looked like disorder from outside and was actually a system working at high speed. Emily moved into it like water finding level. She caught a supply cart that was rolling unattended into a doorway, redirected it. She saw a nurse searching for a BP cuff and handed her one from the rack she'd just passed. She was already gloved by the time the second wave of ambulances pulled in. The third patient off the second wave was the one. Male, mid-40s, brought in unconscious. No ID, massive lacerations to the left arm and face from windshield contact, blood pressure dropping when the paramedics had loaded him, and still dropping when they rolled him through the door. The field team had him on supplemental oxygen, one IV line in, a second one being placed as they moved. Thorne was already at the primary bay, calling the room to order. He assessed the patient in under a minute, visual survey, quick palpation, read the paramedics' field notes, and turned to the team. Tension pneumothorax, he said. Left side. Get me a needle. Emily was at the edge of the bay. She looked at the patient, at the specific way his neck veins were distending, at the tracheal deviation she could see with the naked eye, at the rhythm on the cardiac monitor that had just been connected. She looked at all of it, and she felt the familiar cold clarity of knowing something that someone else had gotten wrong. Dr. Thorne. Her voice was steady and quiet and cut through the noise of the room with a precision that was not loudness but something else. It's not pneumothorax. Thorne turned. The tracheal deviation is to the right, Emily said. His neck veins are distended bilaterally. His pressure isn't responding to the oxygen increase. This is cardiac tamponade. If you needle his chest wall, you'll... Get her out of this bay, Thorne said. Not to Emily, to the room. You will kill him. Emily did not raise her voice. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Clear, factual, without performance. A security guard moved toward her from the door. Thorne had the needle in his hand. The patient's blood pressure on the monitor dropped another 4 points, and the cardiac waveform began the specific, flattening change that Emily had seen on 3 continents under conditions that made a highway pileup look controlled. She had maybe 90 seconds, maybe less. She moved. Not toward Thorne. Toward the crash cart. She was gloved. She pulled the pericardiocentesis needle, a longer needle, different gauge, meant for exactly this and not for pneumothorax decompression, and turned to the bay with it in her hand. Subxiphoid approach, she said to the room. To anyone who was listening, to the scrub tech who had stopped moving and was watching her with wide eyes. I need an ultrasound on his cardiac window right now. Someone get me a syringe. Don't touch that patient. Thorne's voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not just authority. Something closer to alarm. The security guard was 4 feet from her, the cardiac monitor alarmed. The flatline tone was not a flatline. The waveform was still there, faintly, but it was the specific waveform of a heart being compressed from outside by fluid that was filling the pericardial sac with every beat, creating a pressure that would stop it entirely in seconds. Emily had the ultrasound probe in her left hand and the needle positioned in her right. The scrub tech, a young woman named Renata, who had been working trauma for 3 years and had seen enough to know the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who didn't, put the syringe in Emily's right hand without being asked. 11 seconds later, Emily had the needle in place. 17 seconds after that, she drew back the syringe and dark, non-pulsatile blood filled it. Exactly what you saw with cardiac tamponade, exactly what you never saw with pneumothorax. The monitor alarmed again. This time, it was because the blood pressure had jumped 15 points in 9 seconds. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has just happened that everyone present will remember for the rest of their careers. The patient's color changed, his waveform stabilized, his blood pressure climbed to 94/60 and held. Emily stepped back from the bay. She set the needle and syringe on the instrument tray with a precision that made no noise at all. Thorne was standing 4 feet away with the wrong needle still in his hand. Emily peeled her outer glove and looked at him. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, with the flat, exhausted expression of someone who had been right about something they desperately wished they'd been wrong about. "He'll need a cardiothoracic consult," she said, "and an echo as soon as he's stable." The security guard was still standing there, uncertain now about what he'd been sent to do. Thorne looked at the monitor, at the patient breathing steadily on the table, at the syringe on the tray with the evidence of what had just happened sitting in it, undeniable and dark. He looked at Emily last. "Detain her," he said. His voice had a quality in it now that was not anger and was not authority. It was something smaller and more dangerous than either. The security guard's hand closed around Emily's arm, and outside, so distant at first it might have been thunder, the sky above Harlow Falls began to shake. The security guard's name was Terrence Mulvey, and he had worked hospital security for 11 years, which was long enough to know the difference between someone who needed to be removed and someone who had just saved a man's life in front of 30 witnesses. His hand was on Emily Voss's arm. He had put it there because Dr. Thorne had told him to, and Dr. Thorne was on the list of people Terrence was supposed to listen to. But Terrence was also a man who had grown up with a mother who was a nurse, and he had a particular sensitivity to the specific kind of injustice that happened in hospitals when authority and competence ran in opposite directions. He did not tighten his grip. Emily did not resist. She stood exactly where she was, her outer glove on the tray, the syringe beside it with its evidence still visible, and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that the next 60 seconds mattered more than the last 60, and that burning energy on resistance was a calculation she wasn't prepared to make yet. "Let's go," Terrence said quietly. He said it without force, which was the only way he could bring himself to say it at all. Emily let him walk her toward the bay entrance. Behind her, she could hear the trauma team reassembling around the patient, the sounds of people getting back to work, picking up the threads of a situation that had lurched sideways and was now being carefully rerouted. The cardiac monitor was beeping in a steady, measured rhythm that it hadn't been making 3 minutes ago. Someone was calling for a cardiothoracic consult over the intercom, using the exact words Emily had used when she'd stepped back from the bay. She heard Thorne's voice, lowered now, talking to someone she couldn't see. His tone had changed. The command had gone out of it, replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. The voice of a man who understood that the next several hours required him to control a narrative before it had a chance to form on its own. Terrence walked her to a consultation room off the main ER corridor, the kind of room normally used for delivering bad news to families. 2 chairs, a box of tissues on a side table, a single window that looked out onto a service alley. He opened the door, and she went in. "I have to stay outside," he said. He wasn't meeting her eyes. "I know," she said. He closed the door. She heard him take a position just outside it, not locking it, she noted, just standing there, which meant she wasn't under arrest, technically. She was being contained, which was a different thing, and the difference was something that would matter later. She sat down in one of the chairs and looked at the window. The alley below was quiet. A maintenance worker was moving a cart of linens toward a loading dock. 2 pigeons were arguing over something on the concrete, a frantic, ungainly dispute that resolved in about 4 seconds with one of them flying off and the other standing alone looking faintly indignant. Emily watched them and let her heart rate come down. She had known, performing the procedure, that this moment would come. Not this exact version of it, but something like it. The contained room, the weight, the institutional machinery grinding into motion to process what had just happened and decide whose version of it would be the one that survived. She had known it and done the procedure anyway, because the alternative was watching a man die on a table while she stood at the edge of a bay with her hands at her sides. And that was not something she was capable of. She had never been capable of it. It was, depending on the day and who you asked, both her most valuable quality and the one that had caused her the most trouble in her life. She checked her watch. 3:17 p.m. She thought about the patient. No name, no ID. She didn't even know what they'd ended up calling him in the system, and ran the procedure back through her head the way she always did after an acute intervention, not looking for mistakes, but making sure there weren't any she'd missed. The approach had been clean. The fluid draw was textbook. His pressure response had been immediate and appropriate. He was going to need the echo and probably a pericardial window if the effusion reaccumulated, but those were decisions for the cardiothoracic team, and the cardiothoracic team would make them correctly because the patient would now be alive and stable enough to receive that level of care. She had done the thing she could do. The rest was not her problem. She leaned back in the chair and waited. 31 minutes later, the door opened, and it wasn't Terrence. It was Donna Price, which surprised Emily more than almost anything else that had happened today, because Donna had spent 2 weeks carefully positioning herself in the comfortable middle ground between Emily and Thorne, present for everything, responsible for nothing, the kind of institutional survival strategy Emily had watched people perfect over entire careers. Donna came in and closed the door behind her. She didn't sit. She stood near the window and looked at Emily with an expression that was more complicated than anything she'd shown in 2 weeks. "He's stable," Donna said. "The patient. They moved him to the cardiac ICU." "I know he's stable," Emily said. "I heard the monitor. Thorne is talking to administration right now." "What's he saying?" Donna's jaw tightened slightly. "That you performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient without physician authority. That you disregarded a direct order in the middle of a mass casualty event. That you created a dangerous situation in a critical care bay during a period of maximum patient load." She paused. "He's calling it reckless endangerment." Emily absorbed this without visible reaction. "Is that what you're saying?" she asked. The question landed in the room and sat there. Donna looked at the window, at the alley below, at a point somewhere between them. "I'm saying what I saw," Donna said carefully. "I haven't been asked to say it yet." "But you will be." "Yes." "And what did you see?" Another pause. Longer this time. Outside, a hospital transport van pulled into the alley and idled while someone at the loading dock came out to meet it. "I saw a nurse perform a pericardiocentesis on a patient in cardiac tamponade after the attending physician had begun preparing the wrong intervention," Donna said. Her voice was flat and precise, a person reading a document out loud. "I saw the patient's blood pressure stabilize within 90 seconds of the procedure. I saw the monitor data." She stopped. "That's what I saw." Emily looked at her. "Then say it." "Emily." Donna finally turned from the window. Her face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the current shift. "I have 17 more years until I can retire with full benefits. I have a son in his second year of physical therapy school. I have a mortgage that I am 12 years into on a 15-year note." She said all of this without apology, just facts. "I'm not a hero. I never said I was." "I'm not asking you to be a hero," Emily said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth." "The truth in this hospital," Donna said, "goes through Marcus Thorne's administrative access. He controls what gets flagged, what gets buried, what ends up in a personnel file, and what ends up in a formal complaint. He has been doing it for 9 years. She pulled her glasses from her pocket, the pair she never wore, and held them in her right hand, the conductor's baton, the habit of a woman who needed something to do with her hands when she was deciding something. "He's done it before. There was a PA 2 years ago. Jason Merritt filed a clinical complaint against Thorne for a misdiagnosis. 3 months later, Jason Merritt was terminated for cause, documentation issues, they said." She looked at Emily. "He's working in an urgent care clinic in another state now. He was good." Emily listened to all of this. She nodded once, not in defeat, In the way of someone receiving intelligence, they're filing away for later. What are they planning to do with me, she asked. HR is being called. There will be an emergency review. Thorne wants you suspended pending investigation, but they can't do that without a formal process. So right now you're... Donna gestured at the room. Here. How long? Until someone from administration comes down, maybe an hour. Emily looked at the window. Donna, you've been in that unit for how long? 14 years on the surgical and trauma floor. In 14 years, how many times have you seen someone do what I just did? The question wasn't rhetorical. Donna knew it wasn't rhetorical, and that was why she didn't answer it immediately. Once, she said finally. Maybe twice, when it was absolutely necessary. And in those cases, what happened to the patient? They lived, Donna said quietly. Yes, Emily said. They lived. Donna stood there for another moment. Then she put her glasses back in her pocket and went to the door. The administration rep will be here within the hour, she said. She opened the door. For what it's worth. She stopped, not turning around. That drainage flag on Wallace Greer, day one. I knew you were right. I should have backed you. She left. Emily turned back to the window. The transport van was gone. The alley was empty again. She checked her watch. 3:51 p.m. She thought, an hour. She thought, it won't need to be that long. Mart. The overhead sound started at 4:06 p.m. She heard it before she could identify it. A vibration that registered in the chest before it reached the ears. A low rhythmic concussion that could have been a lot of things and wasn't any of them. It was the specific acoustic signature of military-grade rotary aircraft, and to someone who had spent enough time around that sound, it was as distinct as a voice. Emily stood up from her chair. She moved to the window and looked out, but the angle was wrong. The service alley ran east-west, and whatever was inbound was coming from the north, beyond the roofline. She could only hear it, and hearing it was enough. The vibration deepened. 3 distinct sources, overlapping in rhythm, which meant 3 aircraft flying in formation, which meant this was not a medevac, not a Coast Guard operation, not a single military transport. 3 aircraft in formation meant a coordinated deployment, and a coordinated deployment arriving at a regional hospital in the middle of a mass casualty response meant something she had not expected to happen today. She stood at the window and listened to the sound get louder and thought, they moved faster than I expected. In the ER, the mass casualty response had reached its second phase. The initial wave of critical patients had been stabilized or triaged, and the team was working through the moderate injuries, the fractures and lacerations and concussions that didn't require the same sprint speed intervention, but still required attention and care. The department was loud but functional. Terrence Mulvey, still posted outside the consultation room door, heard the aircraft first. He was ex-Army, 4 years as a military police officer before a knee injury rotated him out, and the sound hit something in him that preceded conscious identification. He straightened without meaning to. The ER's automatic glass doors opened to admit another family member being escorted in by a volunteer, and through the open doors, just for a moment, the sound came through fully. Not muffled by walls and floors anymore, but direct and immediate and enormous, the heavy mechanical thunder of Black Hawk helicopters on final approach. Inside the trauma bay, a resident looked up from the chart she was completing. A nurse at the medication station paused mid-count. Thorne, who was across the ER in a corridor adjacent to the administrative offices, heard it through the wall and stopped mid-sentence. The 3 helicopters landed in the hospital's emergency vehicle staging area, the large flat expanse of asphalt beyond the ambulance bay that was technically designated for overflow parking but had never, in anyone at Meridian General's memory, been used for anything else. They landed with a precision that suggested the pilots had looked at this location on a satellite image before today and identified the optimal touchdown configuration. The rotors were still decelerating when the doors opened. 8 personnel in full tactical gear came out first, moving to establish a perimeter that, to the casual observer, might have looked like security, and to anyone with military familiarity, was clearly something more deliberate than that. They were armed. They carried themselves with the particular economy of motion of people for whom controlled environments were a professional requirement, not a personal choice. Then came the personnel in military dress uniform. There were 4 of them, 2 aides, 1 adjutant, and at the front, walking with the contained authority of someone who had been walking into difficult rooms their entire professional life. A woman in her early 60s in Army service uniform, bearing the insignia of a 2-star Major General. Her name, though no one at Meridian General knew it yet, was Major General Sandra Vreeland, and she was the Deputy Director of the Army's Medical Special Operations Command, and she had flown from a base 400 miles away in a timeline that suggested she had been watching this situation with more than casual interest. She walked through the ambulance bay entrance without pausing. The personnel at the entrance, an intake coordinator named Barbara, who had worked this desk for 6 years and had seen a great deal, took one look at the uniform and the bearing and the 8 armed individuals spreading quietly through the lobby and said nothing at all. The general stopped at the ER desk. "I need to speak with your administrator on duty," she said. Her voice was conversational. "And I need to know where Emily Voss is." The charge nurse at the desk, not Donna, a different nurse covering the ER section, looked at her badge, then at the uniform, then at the 2 aides standing slightly behind and to each side of the general, and then she picked up the phone. They brought Vreeland to the consultation room 2 minutes later. Emily heard the footsteps before the door opened, multiple people, not Terrence's lone posting cadence, and the quality of the footfalls told her something about who was coming before she saw them. She was on her feet by the time the door opened. Vreeland came in alone. 1 aide stayed at the door. The rest of the entourage waited in the corridor. The 2 women looked at each other for a moment. Vreeland said, You look tired." Emily said, "I've been sitting in a consultation room for an hour." Before that, 2 weeks undercover in a broken hospital has a way of doing that. Vreeland looked around the room briefly. The chairs, the tissues, the window, the assessment of a person who cataloged environments automatically. They put you in a family notification room. They didn't think too hard about the symbolism. No. Vreeland moved to the window, looked out at the alley briefly, then turned back. "You filed 3 separate incident reports in the last 14 days, 2 clinical flags and 1 administrative escalation. All documented? They were routed to the attending's administrative queue. He closed all 3 without review." "I know." Emily paused. "I made sure there were copies in the patient files where he couldn't reach them. The original flags are technically still in the system, even with his line through them. The system creates a revision history." Something moved across Vreeland's face, not quite a smile, the expression of someone whose expectation has been confirmed. The evaluation team saw the revision histories. That's partly what accelerated the timeline. "How much did they see?" "Enough." Vreeland folded her hands behind her back. "The imaging delay pattern you documented matches a broader trend the evaluation was already tracking. Your incident reports gave them a ground-level timestamp they didn't have before." Emily absorbed this. "The patient from this afternoon. The tamponade. Stable. Cardiothoracic is with him. Thorne is talking to administration right now. He's calling it unauthorized." "I know what he's calling it," Vreeland said. "I read the preliminary complaint on my way in." She paused. "Do you know what Dr. Thorne has never done in 9 years at this hospital?" Emily waited. "Filed a single critical incident report," Vreeland said. "Not one. In 9 years of surgical and trauma practice at a facility that handles approximately 1,200 trauma presentations annually." The number hung in the air. "That's statistically impossible unless they're being suppressed," Emily said. "Yes," Vreeland said. "It is." Silence. Emily looked at the general. "You're going public with the evaluation." "The evaluation has been concluded," Vreeland said. "We've seen what we needed to see. The federal certification review is being suspended effective as of," she checked her watch, "40 minutes ago. A formal notice is being transmitted to the hospital's board of directors as we speak." That's the defense contract. The entire partnership program, suspended pending a comprehensive investigation by the Federal Medical Oversight Board in conjunction with the state licensing authority and the Army Inspector General's office. Emily let out a slow breath. Not relief exactly, the particular exhale of someone who has been holding a very specific kind of tension for a very specific amount of time and has just been told they can release it. "How long was I supposed to be here?" she asked. "The original evaluation window was 30 days, Vreeland said. Events accelerated. The mass casualty incident today, combined with the documented suppression pattern, the evaluation team determined the evidence was sufficient and the situation was developing in a direction that created unacceptable risk to patients. The tamponade, Emily said. That's what did it. A physician nearly killed a patient in cardiac tamponade by misdiagnosing a tension pneumothorax, then attempted to have the only person who correctly identified the condition removed from the premises, Vreeland said, during a mass casualty event. She looked at Emily steadily. Yes, that's what did it. Emily nodded. What happens now? She asked. Now, Vreeland said, I need you to walk out of this room with me. Donna Price was at the nursing station when she saw them come out of the corridor. Emily first, then a woman in army dress uniform whose insignia it took Donna approximately 3 seconds to process, and then 2 aides in uniform, and then through the ER doors visible in the ambulance bay, more military personnel than Donna had ever seen outside of a Memorial Day ceremony. Donna stood very still. She had worked this hospital for 14 years, and she had learned to read the atmosphere of a place the way you learn to read weather, not from any single sign, but from the combination of things, the pressure and the temperature and the particular quality of the light. And the atmosphere of the Meridian General Emergency Department in this moment was unlike anything she had felt in 14 years. People had stopped moving, not completely. The mass casualty response was still ongoing. Patients still needed attention. Monitors still needed reading. But the secondary layer of activity, the ambient motion of staff going about their secondary tasks, had stilled. Heads were up. Eyes were tracking. Emily walked through the ER with the Major General at her side, and she looked exactly the same as she always looked. Contained, observant, not performing anything. And somehow that was the most striking thing of all, because the room was watching her and she wasn't watching the room back. She was looking at the patient bays, checking, automatically, because she couldn't seem to help it, that what needed to be attended to was being attended to. Donna watched her pass and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was close to shame, and it wasn't comfortable. Thorne came out of the administrative corridor at that exact moment. He had clearly been told something. Not enough, judging by his expression, but enough to understand that the sound of helicopters he'd heard through the wall had not been a coincidence. He came through the corridor door and stopped when he saw the uniform, stopped again when he processed the insignia, and stopped a third time, in the way of a man whose understanding of the next several minutes was arriving in sequential shocks, when Emily turned and met his eyes from across the ER. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Thorne looked at the general, at the aides, at the personnel he could see through the glass doors in the ambulance bay. He looked at the ER around him, the mass casualty response still in motion, 30 staff members in various positions throughout the department, patients in every bay, every single person who worked this floor present and watching. He opened his mouth. Vreeland spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She simply projected it, the way people who have commanded large rooms for many years learn to project without volume. A quality of authority that filled the space the same way silence does. Dr. Thorne, she said, my name is Major General Sandra Vreeland, Deputy Director of Army Medical Special Operations Command. I'm here in connection with a federal evaluation of this facility's clinical standards and governance practices. I'd like to speak with you, your Chief of Medicine, and your board liaison simultaneously. Please don't go anywhere. She said it with the same conversational register she'd used with the charge nurse, as if this were a scheduling request, as if there were nothing in the world more ordinary than landing 3 Blackhawks in a hospital parking lot to deliver that sentence. Thorne looked at Emily one more time. Emily looked back at him with the same flat, exhausted expression she'd worn when she'd stepped away from the trauma bay. Not triumph, not anger, just the face of someone who had done the work and was now watching the accounting begin. He looked away first. An aide was already on a radio, coordinating with someone outside. A second aide had moved to block the corridor Thorne had come through. Not physically, just by standing there, present and still and unambiguous. Thorne was not under arrest, but he was not going anywhere, which was precisely what Vreeland had said. The federal investigation team arrived 40 minutes later. They came in 2 vehicles, unmarked, federal plates, and they were 6 people who carried identification that Meridian General's administrator on duty, a man named Gerald Park, who had been called in from home and arrived with his tie imperfectly knotted and a coffee thermos he hadn't managed to leave in his car, examined for a very long time before handing back. Gerald Park had been the administrator at Meridian General for 3 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had inherited a complicated institution and managed it with the primary objective of keeping it solvent and accredited and out of the kind of trouble that appeared in regional newspapers. He had understood in a general way that Dr. Thorne was a complicated figure. He had not understood until 30 minutes ago when a major general had sat down across from him in his own conference room and explained the scope of the evaluation that had been running inside his hospital for the past several weeks, precisely how complicated. He was now understanding it. The federal investigators set up in a conference room on the second floor. They requested access to 17 months of incident reports. They requested the complete patient file revision histories for the surgical and trauma units. They requested the administrative Q logs for Dr. Thorne's account, specifically the Q that received clinical flags and incident reports. Gerald Park authorized all of it, without argument, which was the first smart decision he'd made in a long afternoon. Emily was not in the conference room. She was in the ER, having returned the moment Vreeland released her from immediate escort, because the mass casualty response was still ongoing and there were patients who needed care and whatever else was happening in this hospital tonight, that fact was not suspended. She was in Base 6 with a 32-year-old woman named Priya Sandhu, who had been in the second vehicle of the highway pileup and had a right tibial fracture that had been correctly identified but was taking longer than it should to get a surgical consult because the system was overloaded and surgical consults were being triaged against critical cases. Emily sat with her, not performing anything, just present, in the way that presence itself is sometimes the only accurate response to the fact that a person is in pain and frightened and alone in a curtained bay in a busy ER with something broken inside their body. "Is it always like this?" Priya asked. She meant the noise, the controlled chaos of the department still processing the day's events. "Not usually," Emily said. "Today was unusual." "Were you here for all of it?" "I was here," Emily said. Priya was quiet for a moment. She had dark eyes and paint stains on her left forearm that she'd explained were from a mural she'd been working on in her studio when the highway had rearranged her afternoon. She looked at Emily with the direct assessment of someone who has just been through enough to drop the usual social filters. "You're not a regular nurse here, are you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Emily looked at her. "No," she said. "I'm not." "I could tell," Priya said, "from when you came in to check on me earlier. You looked at me like you were looking at me, not at my chart." She paused. "Most of them look at the chart." Emily said nothing to that, but something shifted slightly in her expression. The surgical consult arrived 12 minutes later. A resident named Dr. Kowalski, who was tired and stretched thin from the afternoon but competent, genuinely competent, in the way that residents sometimes are when they haven't yet had enough time in an institution to absorb its worst habits. He reviewed Priya's imaging, confirmed the fracture type, explained the procedure clearly and without condescension, and was halfway through scheduling when he stopped and looked at Emily. "You're the one from the trauma bay," he said. "The tamponade." Emily kept her face neutral. "I helped with a patient earlier." Kowalski looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who wants to say something and hasn't decided what. "I was in the corridor," he said finally. "I saw the monitor before and after." He paused. "For what it's worth." He went back to Priya's scheduling without waiting for a response. At 7:40 p.m., the federal investigators requested that all senior clinical and administrative staff on shift report to the second-floor conference room for a preliminary interview sequence. The request came through the official administrative channel, signed by the lead investigator and countersigned by Gerald Park, which meant it carried the weight of both federal authority and institutional compliance. Thorne had been in his office for the last 2 hours. One of the general's aides had been outside his door the entire time, not blocking it, just present. Available, as the aide had explained with perfect politeness when Thorne had asked what he was doing there, in case Dr. Thorne needed anything. Thorne had not needed anything. What he'd been doing for 2 hours was making phone calls, his attorney, his malpractice insurer, 2 colleagues at other institutions, a friend on the hospital board whose number he'd been carrying in his personal contacts for situations that required board-level intervention before formal processes made them impossible to redirect. The board member's phone had gone to voicemail on the second try and hadn't been answered since. When the summons to the second floor arrived at 7:40, Thorne read it twice. Then he closed his laptop, adjusted his coat, and went to the door. The aide was still there. "Conference room," Thorne said. "Yes, sir," the aide said. "I'll walk with you." It was stated as courtesy. It wasn't. Donna Price arrived at the conference room at 7:52. She had spent the intervening hours completing her shift with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had decided something and was waiting for the correct moment to act on it. She had checked on every patient on the floor. She had completed every chart. She had handed off to the evening charge nurse with the thorough, unhurried care she always gave to shift transitions. Then she had straightened her badge, picked up her glasses from her pocket, and walked to the elevator. The lead federal investigator was a woman named Agent Lorraine Hsu, 40-something, with reading glasses that she actually wore and a notepad that she actually used, and the patient, persistent manner of someone who understood that the most important information was rarely the first thing people said. When Donna sat down across from her, Hsu said, "Take your time." Donna put her glasses on the table in front of her. She looked at them for a moment. "I've been here 14 years, she said, and I've been watching things that I should have stopped. I want to start there." Hsu uncapped her pen. On the floor below, in the ER, the last patients from the highway pile-up were being moved to their overnight accommodations. Various floors, various units, various beds in a building that was in the process of being turned inside out without any of its patients quite knowing why. The monitors beeped. The IVs dripped. The institution continued its most fundamental function, the one that existed independent of its politics and its personalities and its accumulated failures. In Bay 11 of the ER, the John Doe from the afternoon, the man who had arrived without ID, the man whose heart had been stopped by fluid and restarted by a needle in the hands of a nurse nobody had taken seriously, was being prepared for transfer to the cardiac ICU. His eyes were open. He was looking at the ceiling with the mild, wondering expression of a person who has recently been somewhere else and has returned to find the world still here, still running, still full of ordinary light. A transport nurse came in to prepare him for the move. She checked his lines, confirmed his monitors, reviewed his wristband. "Do you know your name?" she asked. Standard neurocheck. "Daniel," he said. His voice was rough but present. "Daniel Morrow." "Do you know where you are, Daniel?" "Hospital." He paused. "There was a woman. He stopped, uncertain how to finish the sentence. "She was there when I was going." The transport nurse made a notation. "You're going to be fine, Daniel," she said. "You had a lot of people working on you today." He was quiet for a moment as she finished her prep. "I want to thank her," he said. The transport nurse looked at him. Then she looked down the ER corridor, in the direction of Bay 6, where she'd seen the woman in scrubs sitting with the patient with the broken leg. The woman who'd been the last person standing at the trauma bay when everything else had gone sideways today. "I'll see what I can do," she said. She went to Bay 6. Bay 6 was empty. The chair where Emily had been sitting was pushed back from the bedside at a slight angle, the way it lands when someone stands up from it quickly. Priya Sandhu was still there, waiting for transport to pre-op, looking at her phone. The aide from the general's team was at the nursing station at the end of the corridor. The transport nurse asked him, "The nurse who was in Bay 6, do you know where she went?" The aide looked down the corridor. At the nursing station, through the glass doors of the ambulance bay. "She went upstairs," he said. "About 10 minutes ago. Someone called her." "Who called her?" He checked something on his radio. "The general." The transport nurse went back to Daniel Morrow and told him she was sorry. She couldn't find the nurse right now, but she'd leave a note in the system. Daniel nodded and looked at the ceiling again. Above him, on the second floor, in the federal investigators' conference room, Donna Price was still talking. Her glasses were in her hand again, the conductor's baton, moving slightly as she described 9 years of a particular kind of silence that she had maintained and that she was not going to maintain any longer. And in a smaller room off the main conference area, Emily sat across from Major General Vreeland and the lead investigator's deputy, and the three of them were working through a timeline that Emily had been building in her head since the second day of her assignment. Documented, organized, sourced to specific patient files and date-stamped revision histories and administrative Q logs that the investigators now had in their hands. The timeline was long, and it was detailed, and it was not the kind of document that got buried. Not anymore. Emily turned a page in her memory. She was reciting from memory. The written documentation was already in the investigators' files and reached the entry for day 9 of the evaluation, the day she'd been reassigned to the rehabilitation wing, and she was explaining the specific administrative action Thorne had taken to route her incident report back to his own queue when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at it. An unknown number. The text was 3 words. "He's asking for you." She stared at it for a moment, understanding who the message was about, understanding who had sent it. The transport nurse, probably, through a chain of hospital contacts that had reached someone who knew how to find a number. She put the phone face down and kept talking. The timeline was more important than the text, but she noted it, she filed it. And she thought about Daniel Morrow looking at the ceiling in Bay 11, and she thought later, and meant it, and kept going. On the floor below, Thorne sat in a different conference room with his attorney on speakerphone and a federal investigator across the table and 17 months of suppressed incident reports on a laptop screen in front of him. And the expression on his face was one that nobody in his professional life had ever seen before, because the expression was the specific look of a man who has just run out of room. The clock on the wall read 8:23 p.m., and somewhere in the parking lot, 3 Blackhawks sat dark and still on the asphalt, their rotors long since stopped, waiting. The waiting had its own weight. Thorne felt it in the room. The particular density of air in a space where 3 people are present, and only one of them doesn't fully understand what's about to happen. His attorney, Raymond Kell, was on speakerphone on the table between them, and Raymond was a good attorney, genuinely good, the kind who had gotten Thorne out of a malpractice deposition 4 years ago by finding a procedural inconsistency in the plaintiff's timeline and pulling on it until the whole case unraveled. Raymond had done things for Thorne that required a specific kind of legal creativity, and Thorne had paid him well for it, and their relationship had the comfortable architecture of 2 people who understood each other's utility. Raymond was not comfortable right now. "I need 5 minutes with my client," Raymond said through the speaker. His voice had the calibrated neutrality of an attorney who has just seen the scope of a document set and is doing rapid internal calculations. The federal investigator across the table, a man named Special Agent Derek Farrow, compact, methodical, who had been taking notes by hand in a small notebook rather than on a laptop, which Thorne found inexplicably unnerving, looked at his watch. 10 minutes, Farrow said. "We'll be in the corridor." He left with his colleague, a younger woman named Agent Britta Torres, who had not spoken a single word since the interview began but had been reading documents from a folder with an attention that suggested she was memorizing rather than skimming. The door closed. Thorne leaned toward the phone. "Raymond." "Don't say anything else," Raymond said. "Not right now. I need to understand what they have." "They have incident reports, administrative logs. I can explain all of—" "Marcus." Raymond's voice dropped to the specific register of a man delivering information that is not going to be received well. "They have 17 months of your administrative queue. They have the revision histories from the patient file system showing notations that were altered or removed. They have timestamps." A pause. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Thorne was quiet. "The Q logs show that you received 43 clinical flags across the surgical and trauma units in 17 months, Raymond said, and that 31 of them were closed without documented review within 24 hours of receipt. That's standard administrative processing when 3 of the patients associated with those flags had adverse outcomes within 72 hours of the flag being closed, Raymond said. 1 of them died. The room was very quiet. Thorne sat back. He had known about the patient. Of course he had known. A 67-year-old man named Arthur Dean, post-surgical complications, sepsis that had progressed faster than the standard trajectory, death on the 4th post-operative day. It had been reviewed by the Internal Quality Committee and classified as an expected complication of his underlying condition. Thorne had signed off on that classification. It had been accurate. As far as classifications went, Dean had been very sick before his surgery, and very sick people who had surgery sometimes died from complications. What Thorne had not thought about, until this moment, Sitting in this room with this phone call was that the clinical flag filed by a floor nurse 2 days before Dean's death, a flag noting increased inflammatory markers and a fever trend that didn't match the postoperative profile, had sat in his administrative queue for 19 hours before he'd closed it without comment or follow-up. He had not thought about it because he had not remembered it, because flags came in constantly, and he'd developed over years a particular efficiency with them, a rapid triage based on his own assessment of the flagging nurse's credibility, the patient's baseline complexity, and the degree to which the flag contradicted his own clinical picture. He had triaged Dean's flag into the category of overcautious floor nursing and closed it. 19 hours later, Dean had gone into septic shock. "Raymond," Thorne said. "Don't," Raymond said quietly. Thorne stopped. Outside the door in the corridor, Farrow and Torres were standing with the particular stillness of people who are not discussing anything in particular because the room they've just left is almost certainly recording what's happening inside it, and they are very experienced people who understand how rooms work. Emily finished the last section of her timeline at 9:04 p.m. She closed the folder, her own copy. The institutional record was already in the investigator's hands, and set it on the table. Her hands, she noticed with the detached interest of someone observing themselves from a slight distance, had a very slight tremor in them. Not from fear, from the particular physical cost of sustained high-concentration activity that you didn't notice while you were doing it and caught up with you the moment you stopped. She pressed them flat on the table and the tremor went away. Vreeland was watching her. The deputy investigator had stepped out 10 minutes ago for a phone call and hadn't returned, which meant something was developing in one of the other interview rooms. "When did you last eat?" Vreeland asked. Emily thought about it. "Sandwich, around 7 this morning." "That's 14 hours. I had coffee." Emily: "I know." She pushed her chair back slightly. Not standing up, just creating a few more inches of space, the unconscious physical adjustment of someone who's been folded into a conference room chair for too long. "What's happening with Thorne?" "Farrow's handling it." "The Arthur Dean flag," Emily said. Vreeland looked at her. "You knew about Dean." "I found the closed flag in the revision history on day 7. I included it in the documentation." She paused. "I didn't know his outcome when I found it. I cross-referenced the patient records after. The timeline—" She stopped. "I wrote it down. It's in the Section 3 appendix." Vreeland was quiet for a moment. "The Dean documentation is what the board is going to find hardest to manage," she said. "Everything else is clinical negligence, administrative misconduct, pattern, suppression. That's damaging. But Dean is a closed flag on a patient who subsequently died. That changes the category." Emily said nothing. She had known this since day 7, when she'd pulled up Arthur Dean's patient record and spent 20 minutes very carefully reading the postoperative notes, the flag closure, and the death certificate, and had felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not surprise, because she'd stopped being surprised by the things that happen in poorly run institutions, but a specific kind of grief that came from understanding that a preventable death had happened and that the mechanism of its prevention had existed and been bypassed. She had written it down carefully and moved on, because there was nothing else to do with it in that moment. The writing it down was the thing she could do. "Is Donna still with Shu?" Emily asked. "Third interview. She's been talking for 2 hours. She'll tell them everything." "She already has." Vreeland tilted her head slightly. "Did you know she would?" Emily thought about the break room conversation, the mortgage, the son in physical therapy school, the 17 remaining years. "I knew she might," she said. "I didn't count on it." "What did you count on?" "The documentation." Emily looked at the closed folder. "The documentation doesn't change its mind based on what's survivable." The board liaison was a man named Howard Strick, 63, who had the silver-haired composure of someone who had managed institutional crises before and believed, right up until the moment he sat down across from Vreeland at 9:30 p.m., that this was the kind of situation that could be managed. He had driven in from a dinner party. He was still in his jacket. He had, in the car on the way over, formulated an approach: express cooperative concern, request time to conduct an internal review before any external findings were formalized, propose a joint oversight committee, suggest a voluntary corrective action plan. These were the moves. He had made them before with state licensing bodies and insurance auditors, and once, memorably, with the Department of Health investigative team, and he had made them successfully. He sat down across from Vreeland and opened his mouth. Vreeland said, "Mr. Strick, I want to be direct with you. The federal evaluation of Meridian General's clinical standards and governance practices has been concluded. The findings are substantial. I'm going to walk you through them now, not because your response will affect the findings, but because you have the right to understand what is about to be communicated to the full board." Howard Strick closed his mouth. Vreeland spent 22 minutes walking him through the findings. She did it without drama and without pause, and without giving him any of the gaps in which a skilled institutional representative could insert the moves he had prepared. She was specific about dates, specific about patient outcomes, specific about the administrative suppression pattern, and very specific about Arthur Dean. When she reached Dean, Howard Strick stopped looking at the table and started looking at the window. It was a different kind of looking from the one he'd come in with. Not the forward assessment of a man preparing to act, but the backward-focused gaze of a man revising his understanding of several years' worth of events he had not known to interpret differently. "The board wasn't aware," he said when Vreeland finished. "I know," Vreeland said. "That is itself a finding. The governance structure at this institution did not have adequate visibility into clinical quality metrics. That's a systemic failure, not an individual one, but it is a failure." What does this mean specifically for the hospital's operation? The federal certification and associated defense partnership are suspended. The state licensing authority has been notified and will be initiating their own review beginning Monday. The hospital itself will continue to operate and treat patients. There's no grounds to suspend operations absent an immediate safety emergency, but it will operate under a monitoring arrangement to be specified in the formal notice your board will receive tomorrow morning. And Dr. Thorne's clinical privileges are a matter for the hospital's medical executive committee and the state medical board, Vreeland said. "I would suggest the medical executive committee convene a hearing at the earliest possible time." Howard Strick was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the window, and whatever he was seeing in it was not the service parking lot below. "The nurse," he said. "Voss, she was conducting a classified federal evaluation," Vreeland said. "Her activities at this hospital were authorized by Army Medical Special Operations Command in coordination with the Federal Medical Oversight Board. Her clinical interventions, including the one today in the trauma bay, were consistent with her training and credentials and were clinically appropriate." "What are her credentials exactly?" Vreeland looked at him for a moment. "I'll have that information included in the formal documentation," she said, which was a different answer than he'd asked for, but was the only one he was going to get tonight. Emily was in the ER at 10:15 p.m. She had left the second floor as soon as Vreeland released her from the interview, not because she'd been dismissed, but because Vreeland had said, "We have what we need from you tonight," in the tone of someone who genuinely meant it and wasn't going to need her back in the next hour. And Emily had stood up and gone where the work was. The mass casualty response was winding down. The critical patients were in their respective ICUs. The moderate injuries were in beds. The ER was returning to its ordinary late evening rhythm, quieter but not quiet, the specific sound of a department that handles a city's emergencies around the clock and never fully rests. She was restocking a medication cart in Bay 4, one of the basic tasks that nobody noticed when it was done and noticed immediately when it wasn't, when Preston Okafor found her. Preston was the night nurse who had caught Wallace Greer's bile leak drain output on Emily's first day. He was 26, with reading glasses he actually needed, and a habit of reviewing his own clinical decisions out loud under his breath while he worked, a quality Emily had identified early as a sign of someone who was still genuinely learning and hadn't yet stopped. He stood in the bay entrance looking at her with an expression that was several things at once. "I heard what happened," he said. "In the trauma bay, this afternoon." Emily checked a medication label. "A lot happened in the trauma bay this afternoon." "The tamponade." She looked at him. "I was on my break," he said. "I came back through the ER and I saw the monitor. After." He paused. "I've been in this hospital 8 months. I've never seen a pressure recovery like that. Not that fast." Emily returned the medication to the cart. The procedure works quickly when the diagnosis is right. How did you know? The tracheal deviation? Bilateral JVD, she said. Jugular venous distension on both sides. Tension pneumothorax gives you unilateral shift. Tamponade is bilateral. Plus the pressure wasn't responding to oxygen augmentation, which it should have, even slightly, with a pneumothorax. The hemodynamic pattern was wrong for the diagnosis. She looked at him. It's not magic, it's pattern recognition from a lot of repetition. Where did you... He stopped himself. Something in his expression shifted. Sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to ask that. You're not, she said. Not tonight. He nodded. That was fair. He turned to go, then stopped. Greer, he said. Wallace Greer, the bile leak on your first day. I was the one who caught it on nights. I know. It was in the handoff documentation. I've been thinking about that flag. The one on his chart. There was a line through it. He met her eyes. I looked at the revision history. The flag was filed at 2:47 p.m. and the line went through it at 3:09 p.m. 22 minutes. He paused. The leak presented at 7:40 p.m., almost 5 hours later. Emily looked at him steadily. Yes, that's the kind of thing they're investigating, isn't it? Yes. Preston was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bay around them, the equipment, the monitors, the ordinary infrastructure of a place where people came when they were hurt and needed help. He looked at it with the expression of someone who is recalibrating their relationship to an environment they thought they understood. Is it going to change? He asked. Here, is it actually going to change? Emily thought about Howard Strick at the window, about Donna's voice in the investigator's conference room, steady and specific, 14 years of accumulated silence finally spoken, about the federal team with their Q logs and their revision histories and their methodical, patient process of building a record that would survive every attempt to bury it. Yes, she said, it's going to change. She believed it. She was also experienced enough to know that the change would be slower and more complicated and less complete than the word made it sound, and that the institution would carry its scars for a long time, and that the people who had been harmed by it, Arthur Dean most irreversibly, could not be restored by any investigation. She believed it anyway, because the alternative was a kind of cynicism she had decided a long time ago she couldn't afford. At 11 p.m., Thorne left the second-floor conference room with Raymond Kell, who had arrived in person at 9:45, a 70-minute drive from the city, which suggested Raymond had left within minutes of ending the speakerphone call. Raymond had come with a second attorney, a younger woman who specialized in medical licensing defense, and the three of them had been with Farrow and Torres for another 90 minutes. Thorne walked out of the conference room and down the second-floor corridor, looking like a man who has just understood the full dimensions of a room he's been standing in without realizing it for 9 years. He passed the nursing station. 2 nurses on the evening shift looked up and looked back down. Not with sympathy. Not with triumph either. With the specific neutrality of people who have learned, in this environment, to keep their expressions completely manageable, and who were in the process of updating their understanding of why they'd had to learn that. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button for the ground floor. In the elevator, alone, the managed expression dropped. It wasn't guilt, exactly. Or not only guilt, it was the more complex experience of a person who genuinely believed on most levels that he was good at his job and had done right by his patients, being confronted with the specific documented instances where he had not, and finding that the belief and the instances were both true simultaneously and that one did not cancel out the other, and that the one that was going to matter to the investigators and the board and the medical licensing authority was not the belief. The elevator opened on the ground floor. He walked through the ER without looking at anyone and went to his office and closed the door. At 11:47 p.m., Emily's phone rang. It was Vreeland. She was still in the building. Emily could tell from the background acoustics, the specific hollow echo of a hospital corridor at night. "I'm sending you something," Vreeland said. "Check your secure line." Emily used the tablet she'd been issued for the evaluation. She'd had it in her duffel since day one, never taken it out in the hospital, and connected to the secure channel. What Vreeland sent was a preliminary findings summary. 7 pages. Emily read them in the stairwell, where the light was consistent, and nobody needed her for anything. The findings were comprehensive was the word that came to mind first, followed immediately by the more accurate word, which was devastating. 31 suppressed clinical flags across 17 months, 3 associated adverse outcomes, 1 death, a pattern of administrative cue manipulation that had been, the investigators concluded, intentional and systematic rather than the result of oversight or capacity issues. A formal recommendation for referral to the State Medical Board for licensing review. A second formal recommendation for referral to the Federal Department of Health and Human Services for potential criminal investigation under provisions relating to falsification of medical records. Emily read the last page twice. Criminal investigation. She had known it was possible. She had not let herself assume it, because assuming outcomes before they were confirmed was a discipline failure she'd trained herself out of years ago. But she had known it was possible. She closed the tablet and sat for a moment on the stairwell step with her back against the wall and her arms on her knees, and let herself be a person in a stairwell at midnight who's been awake for 19 hours and has just read a document that represents the conclusion of a 2-week mission that had required her to be, simultaneously, a competent floor nurse, a covert federal evaluator, and a person who was willing to perform emergency battlefield medicine in a trauma bay while a security guard was walking toward her. She was tired. She was allowed to be tired. She gave herself 4 minutes. Then she stood up, put the tablet back in her bag, and went back to work. The morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. to a hospital that looked, from the outside, exactly like the hospital it had been the day before. The federal investigators' vehicles were still in the parking lot. The 3 Blackhawks were in the staging area, covered now with the tie-down equipment that ground crews used to secure parked rotary aircraft. The ER was in its morning transition. Night shift patients handed off, morning teams coming in, the institutional rhythm continuing with the dependability that was both its greatest virtue and, sometimes, its greatest cover. Donna Price arrived for her shift at 5:55. She went to her locker, changed into scrubs, and stood at the mirror for a moment doing the small inventory of a person who has slept badly and knows the day ahead requires them to be present anyway. She looked tired. She also looked, fractionally, like someone who had set something down that had been very heavy and whose body hadn't yet fully registered the absence of the weight. She went to the nursing station and began her shift review. The morning's patient census was routine. Overnight admissions, medication schedules, handoff notes from the night charge. She was reading the 3rd chart when she saw the notation in the unit log. Pending. Medical Executive Committee convening notice. Urgent. All senior clinical staff to receive notice by 0800. Full staff meeting scheduled 1400. Administrative briefing at 0900. She read it twice. The Medical Executive Committee convening notice meant a formal hearing process was beginning. A 9 o'clock administrative briefing meant Gerald Park was addressing the clinical leadership before the findings became general knowledge. A 2 o'clock full staff meeting meant those findings were going to be communicated to the entire hospital today. Donna set the chart down. She looked at the nursing station around her, the whiteboard with its 3 overlapping schedules, the medication carts with their slightly off wheels, the supply closet with its hybrid organizational logic. She thought about what 14 years of a place looked like from the inside, and how different the same 14 years looked from the outside, and which view was more honest. The morning light was coming through the windows at the end of the corridor, gray February morning light, thin and pale, the same light that had been there the day before and would be there tomorrow. The hospital was still the hospital. The patients in the beds were still the patients in the beds. Things that needed to be done still needed to be done. She picked up the next chart and kept reading. Emily was in the cardiac ICU at 6:30 a.m. She had stayed through the night, not officially. Her shift had ended at 7 the previous evening, and she hadn't been reassigned. But the mass casualty patients needed monitoring, and she had nothing to go home to except a rented apartment with a half-unpacked duffel bag and a secure tablet she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, and staying felt more useful than leaving. She was not alone in this. Preston Okafor was still there 2 hours past the end of his own shift. The young resident Kowalski was on his 3rd coffee, rounding on his overnight admits. The specific culture of a place, Emily had observed, was most visible at the end of a hard day, in the gap between who was still there and who had gone home. Daniel Morrow was awake when she came into his room. He was sitting up slightly, which was more than he'd been managing the night before. His color was better. The oxygen saturation on his monitor read 97, which was good. His pericardial drainage tube was in place, and the output was within normal post-procedure range. He looked at her when she came in. She had not come specifically to see him. She had come to check his output log and note the readings for the morning team. But he was awake, and he looked at her, and she stood at the foot of his bed and let herself be looked at. "You're the one," he said. "I'm one of many," she said. The cardiothoracic team did the definitive procedure. The transport team kept you stable. The ER team, "You're the one," he said again. Not arguing, just stating something he knew. Emily looked at his chart. "How are you feeling?" "Like I died and came back." He said it matter-of-factly. "Is that what happened?" "You were in cardiac tamponade. Fluid around your heart was compressing it. We drained it." "We," he said. She looked at him. "The nurse at the desk last night said you did it," he said. "She said a doctor was about to do the wrong procedure, and a nurse stopped him and did the right one." Emily returned her attention to his chart. His drainage output was trending correctly. His echo from the night before showed no reaccumulation. The cardiothoracic team would review him at 8 and make a decision about removing the drain. "I want to tell someone," Daniel said, "about what you did. I want someone to know." "People know," Emily said. "There are 30 people in the ER who were there." "Not like that. I want it to matter, in a way that sticks." Emily put the chart back in its slot. She looked at him, at his face, which was ordinary and worn, and currently carrying the particular expression of a man who has recently been reminded that he is not immortal and is trying to figure out what to do with that information. "It'll stick," she said. "I promise you, Mr. Morrow, what happened here is going to stick." She left him with that and went back into the corridor. The morning report from the investigators' team had included one piece of information Vreeland had delivered as a footnote, almost casual: the identity of 3 witnesses from the trauma bay who had filed formal statements overnight supporting Emily's account of the tamponade intervention. The scrub tech, Renata, had been one. Preston Okafor, who had caught the aftermath on his return from break, had been another. The third witness was Farida Osei, the second-year resident who had watched Emily swap the defibrillator pads on the crash cart 6 days ago, who had described it to 2 other residents in admiring terms, who had apparently been watching Emily with the quiet attention of someone forming a conclusion they hadn't yet been asked to articulate. Farida Osei had submitted 8 pages of written statement. Emily had not known about Farida. She had not known the resident was watching. The small things she did, the automatic corrections, the quiet management of a unit's 1,000 small failures, she did them because they needed doing, not because she expected anyone to notice. She had spent 2 weeks doing them without witnessing any of it, and Farida Osei had been watching the whole time and writing it down in her head. That mattered, not for the investigation. The investigation had more than it needed, but in the way that things mattered when you'd been working in a place where noticing was dangerous and someone had noticed anyway. Emily stood in the cardiac ICU corridor for a moment, her back to the wall, her eyes on the middle distance, and thought about Farida Osei writing 8 pages she hadn't been asked to write. Then her secure tablet, in the bag on her shoulder, vibrated once. She pulled it out. The message was from the Army Medical Special Operations Command Operations Desk, not from Vreeland personally. It was flagged Priority 1, which was not a flag the operations desk used casually. She read it. Then she read it again. The message was 4 lines. 3 of them were standard operational language: verification codes, timestamps, the procedural framing of an urgent communication. The 4th line was the content, and the content was this: a situation had developed at a military installation 300 miles to the north. A situation involving mass casualties from an incident that had occurred in the last 4 hours. A situation in which the installation's medical capacity was overwhelmed and outside trauma support was being requested through emergency military channels. And Emily's name was at the top of the list of available personnel with the specific combination of qualifications the situation required. She lowered the tablet. 300 miles. The Blackhawks in the parking lot could cover that in under 2 hours. She looked at the time, 6:48 a.m. She looked at the corridor around her. The ICU, the patients behind their doors, the monitors, the ordinary ongoing work of a unit doing what it was built to do. She looked at the message again. She thought, I'm not done here. And simultaneously, I'm needed there. The two thoughts occupied the same moment, and the wait between them was not simple, and she stood in the corridor and held it for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the second floor. Vreeland was in the hallway outside the conference room, phone to her ear, when Emily came off the elevator. She saw Emily's face and ended the call. You got the message, Vreeland said. When did it come in? 40 minutes ago. I was going to bring it to you at 7. What's the situation? Training exercise gone wrong at Harmon Military Complex? Structural collapse, possibly 40 personnel involved. Their surgical capacity is 2 doctors and a forward medical unit that's equipped for field stabilization, not complex trauma. Emily had already done the math on 40 patients and 2 surgeons. It was not good math. I need to be on a helicopter in 20 minutes, she said. I know. The investigation is concluded, Vreeland said. Your testimony is documented. Your timeline is in evidence. There is nothing more you're required to be here for. She paused. You've done everything this place needed. Emily looked at the closed door of the conference room. Through it, she could hear the faint sound of voices, the investigators, still at work, the institutional machinery of accountability in motion. She thought about Wallace Greer in his recovery room, the bile leak caught in time. She thought about Priya Sandhu in pre-op with her fractured tibia and paint stains on her arm. She thought about Farida Osei and her 8 pages. She thought about Preston Okafor asking if it was going to change, and the answer she had given him. She thought about Arthur Dean, whose closed flag she had found on day 7 and written down because it was the thing she could do. The staff meeting is at 2, Emily said. Yes? Will you be there? Yes? Will you... She stopped, restarted. Will you tell them? All of it. Not just the institutional findings, the part about why it matters. The part that's about the patients and not the paperwork. Vreeland looked at her with an expression that was several things overlapping. Respect, something that was close to affection, and the slight sadness of a senior officer watching someone who is exceptionally good at something that costs them something every time they do it. Yes, Vreeland said. I'll tell them. Emily nodded. 15 minutes, she said. I need to do 2 things first. She went back down to the cardiac ICU. Daniel Morrow was still awake. She came to the door of his room. The cardiothoracic team comes at 8, she said from the doorway. Ask them about the echo results from last night. If the reaccumulation is 0 or near 0, ask them when the drain comes out. Don't let them rush it. They'll want to, because the schedule is full. But the drain timeline matters for your recovery. He looked at her. You're leaving. Yes? Are you coming back? She thought about that honestly. I don't know. He absorbed this. Will I find out who you are eventually? Eventually, she said. There'll be documentation. This hospital is going to have a lot of documentation going forward. He nodded slowly. His hand moved to the bed rail, not gripping it exactly, just resting there. Thank you, he said. For what it's worth. It's worth something, she said, which was as much as she could offer honestly, and went back to the corridor. The second thing took her to the nursing station on the 3rd floor, where Donna Price was completing a medication audit with the systematic attention of someone who has decided to do every part of their job correctly going forward, as if correct performance of the ordinary tasks is itself a kind of reparation. Emily came to the station and stood across from her. Donna looked up. She looked at Emily's bag on her shoulder, the tablet, the posture of someone who is departing. You're going, Donna said. I'm needed somewhere else. Donna set down her pen. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, The drainage flag, day 1. I should have backed you. You said that last night. I know. She met Emily's eyes. I'm saying it again because once isn't enough. Emily looked at her. At the 14 years in Donna's face, not just the age, but the specific accumulation of a person who had been smart enough to see things clearly and cautious enough not to say so, and who was now sitting with the specific weight of that combination. You told the truth last night, Emily said. That counts. Does it? Yes, Emily said. It does. It doesn't undo what it didn't change, but it counts. Donna looked at the medication audit in front of her. She picked up her pen. The two nurses who filed reports that Thorne closed, she said. They're both still on staff. They don't know yet that their reports are in the federal record. They don't know that someone saw what happened to them. She looked up. When the staff meeting happens this afternoon, I want to make sure they're told directly, not just generally. Is there someone I should talk to about that? Vreeland, Emily said. Second floor. Tell her exactly what you just told me. Donna nodded. She held her pen in her right hand, not writing, just holding it. Emily picked up her bag. She walked toward the elevator. Voss, Donna called after her. Emily turned. Whatever it is you actually are. Donna gestured briefly, the glasses conductor motion, toward the uniform insignia she couldn't see but somehow knew was behind the scrubs. You're good at it. Emily looked at her for a moment. Then she pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. She pressed the button for the lobby. She thought about the Blackhawks in the parking lot. She thought about 40 personnel under a collapsed structure 300 miles north. She thought about 2 surgeons and a forward medical unit that was equipped for stabilization and not for what was coming through their doors. She thought 20 minutes. The elevator descended. On the second floor, in the conference room, the investigators were still working. On the third floor, Donna Price was writing something. Not the medication audit, something else. A note she was composing carefully, addressed to the 2 nurses whose reports had disappeared into an administrative queue. In the cardiac ICU, Daniel Morrow's monitor beeped in its steady, recovered rhythm. In his office on the ground floor, Marcus Thorne sat with his phone on the desk in front of him, his attorney's number on the screen, his hand not quite reaching for it. The elevator opened on the lobby. Emily walked through the ER, which was in its morning routine, which did not stop for her departure because it did not know she was departing and would not know until later, when someone looked for her and found an empty bay and a restocked medication cart and a note in the unit log that said nothing except the clinical facts she'd documented through the night. She pushed through the doors into the February morning. The air was cold and thin and smelled like frost and exhaust and the specific metallic smell that large machinery leaves on asphalt. The Blackhawks were in the staging area. One of them already had its rotors turning. She walked toward it. She was 20 feet away when her tablet vibrated again. She pulled it out without slowing. The new message was not from the operations desk. It was from an encrypted address she recognized. Not a name, just a designator that corresponded to a specific office within the Army Inspector General's command. The office that handled the most sensitive tier of the evaluations she'd been conducting. She read the message. She stopped walking. The rotor wash hit her, cold and insistent, pulling at her bag and her hair and the edge of her jacket. She read the message a second time to make sure she'd understood it. She had. The message said that the preliminary investigation of Meridian General's governance records had flagged a secondary financial anomaly in the hospital's defense contract billing. An anomaly that, on initial examination, did not appear to be administrative error. An anomaly that had been referred, as of 6 hours ago, to a separate federal unit. An anomaly that traced not to Thorne and not to Gerald Park, but to a name that Emily did not recognize. A name that appeared in the hospital's financial records going back 4 years. A name that also appeared, and this was the part that had stopped her feet, in a cross-reference file the IG's office maintained on individuals with connections to 3 separate federal medical facilities that had been flagged in the last 2 years for similar patterns. Someone had been running this, not just at Meridian General, and whoever they were, they had just figured out that the evaluation had concluded. The rotor wash increased. The pilot was ready. Emily looked at the tablet, at the name in the message, at the cross-reference file designation that said this was not the end of something, but the edge of something much larger. She looked back at the hospital. Through the glass doors of the lobby, she could see the ER in its morning motion. Beyond that, invisible from here, the floors and the units and the people in the beds and the people in the conference rooms and the people writing notes and the people restocking carts and the people just beginning to understand that the institution they'd been working in was about to become something different. She looked at the helicopter. She looked at the message. She thought, 40 personnel under a collapsed structure. She thought, someone is running this across multiple facilities. She thought, both of these things are true right now, and only one of them can have her in the next 5 minutes. She made the call. She put the tablet away, walked the last 20 feet to the helicopter, and climbed in. The door sealed behind her. The rotors increased. The ground fell away. She looked out the window as the hospital got smaller below her. The parking lot, the staging area, the ER entrance with its ambulances, the building that had been her world for 2 weeks and was now becoming a rectangle of gray structure receding against a gray February sky. Her tablet buzzed a third time. She did not look at it yet. She would need to look at it very soon, because the name in the cross-reference file, the name she'd read twice to make sure, was not a stranger. She had seen that name before. Not at Meridian General, somewhere else. Somewhere before. In a context that, if her memory was right, changed what she thought she understood about why she'd been sent to Harlow Falls in the first place. The helicopter banked north. Below her, the city of Harlow Falls was waking up, morning traffic beginning to move, its hospital a gray rectangle among gray rectangles, carrying everything that had happened in its walls the way institutions carry things, the visible record and the buried one, and everything in between. Emily pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. 30 seconds was all she would take. Then she opened them, picked up the tablet, and started reading. The name in the message was Harlan Vess. Emily read it a second time, then a third, with the same focused attention she gave to anything that contradicted what she thought she understood, which was that this evaluation had been about Meridian General and Marcus Thorne and the specific institutional rot of a hospital that had stopped holding itself accountable. Harlan Vess was not a doctor. He was not a hospital administrator. He was not anyone whose name should have appeared in the financial records of a regional trauma facility in Harlow Falls. She knew who he was because she had read a file on him 14 months ago, in a different context entirely, a financial review of contractor billing irregularities at a Veterans Administration facility in the Pacific Northwest. The file had crossed her desk as background material for an evaluation she'd been preparing for, and Vess had been a peripheral figure in that case, a healthcare consulting firm owner whose company had billed for oversight services that, on examination, had never been clearly performed. The VA case had been referred to the Department of Justice and had then, as far as Emily had known, proceeded through that channel without further connection to anything she was working on. She had not been told that Harlan Vess appeared in the financial records of 3 subsequent federal medical facilities that had been flagged in the last 2 years. She had not been told that Meridian General was the 4th. The helicopter was banking north, the city falling away beneath them, and Emily sat with the tablet and the particular cold clarity of someone rearranging a mental model that has just been revealed to be wrong in a structural way. She opened the cross-reference file. It was dense. The IG's office didn't write for readability, it wrote for precision, and the precision required significant unpacking. She worked through it methodically, which was the only way to work through something like this in the back of a moving helicopter with rotor noise vibrating through the frame. The pattern was consistent across all 4 facilities, consulting contracts awarded to a firm registered under a parent company that traced, through 2 holding entities, to Harlan Vess. The contracts were for healthcare governance advisory services. Broadly defined, difficult to audit, the kind of contract that provided maximum billing flexibility and minimum deliverable specificity. The contracts at each facility had been awarded during periods when the facility was engaged in or pursuing federal certification or defense partnership programs. Emily looked up from the tablet and looked at the back of the pilot's seat without seeing it. The federal certification that Meridian General had been pursuing, the one whose suspension had been Vreeland's first formal action last night. That certification process was what had triggered the evaluation Emily had been sent to conduct. But the certification process had also, she now understood, been the mechanism through which Harlan Vess's consulting firm had inserted itself into the hospital's financial structure 18 months ago. The evaluation had been looking at clinical standards. It had found what it was looking for. But underneath the clinical standards problem, underneath Thorne and his suppressed flags and his administrative queue and Arthur Dean's closed chart, there had been a financial architecture that someone had constructed deliberately, connecting 4 separate institutions through a network of consulting contracts that existed to move money in a direction nobody had been looking at. The IG's referral had gone to the Financial Crimes Unit 6 hours ago, which meant someone at the IG's office had seen this pattern, made the referral, and then, Emily checked the timestamp, sent this message to her 12 minutes later. She thought about why someone would send this to her 12 minutes after making a referral to the Financial Crimes Unit. The referral was already made. The appropriate people already had it. There was no operational reason to notify the field agent who had just concluded a clinical standards evaluation. Unless the person sending the message believed the field agent had information relevant to the financial investigation that the financial investigators didn't have yet. She thought about what she might know that they didn't. She thought about Thorne, about the 9 years of suppressed flags, about the 17 months of administrative Q logs, about the specific timeline of the consulting contract, which the IG's cross-reference said had been awarded 18 months ago. Thorne's pattern of flag suppression extended 17 months back, which the investigators had noted as the available range of the administrative records they'd accessed. But Thorne had been at Meridian General for 9 years. Emily had assumed, everyone had assumed, that the flag suppression was Thorne's own institutional habit, developed over years of unchecked authority. The record showed 17 months because that was what they'd pulled. If someone had paid for the suppression, if Harlan Vess's consulting contract was not just financial extraction, but also, in some form, a mechanism for ensuring that the hospital's clinical governance remained compromised enough to avoid the kind of internal scrutiny that might expose the billing irregularities, then the suppression wasn't Thorne's independent habit. It was a service he was providing, knowingly or otherwise. Emily thought knowingly. She thought about Thorne's face in the elevator at the end of the night. Not guilt over Arthur Dean. Something else. The more complex experience of a man calculating whether a particular wall was going to hold. She picked up the secure line on the tablet and called Vreeland. Vreeland answered in 2 rings. "You read the IG message," Vreeland said. Not a question. Thorne knew about Vess, Emily said. The flag suppression wasn't just institutional arrogance. Someone was maintaining it. A pause. That's not confirmed. The consulting contract was awarded 18 months ago. The accessible administrative records go back 17 months. Someone set the record retention window. She waited a beat. That's not a coincidence. Another pause, longer this time. "We're going to need you to submit a supplemental statement," Vreeland said. "I know. I'll have it to you before we land." She paused. Vreeland. Who else knows about Vess in connection with Meridian General? As of 6 hours ago, the IG referral team, financial crimes, and now you. Does Thorne's attorney know? Not from us. Emily thought about Raymond Kell and his second attorney, the licensing defense specialist. She thought about Thorne in his office with his phone on the desk, the number on the screen, his hand not reaching for it. "You need someone in Thorne's building tonight," she said, before Raymond Kell gets an early morning call that changes his advice. "We have someone," Vreeland said. "Financial crimes moved fast." "Good." Emily looked out the window. The landscape below was highway and winter fields and the occasional cluster of light that marked a town. "How long until the staff meeting?" 7 hours. "Will you change what you tell them?" A beat. "What do you mean?" "The staff meeting at 2. Will you tell them about Vess?" "The financial investigation is separate from They deserve to know," Emily said, that the thing they were working inside was not just one man's arrogance, that there was a structure, that the reason the flags got closed was not only because Thorne had bad judgment. She stopped. These are people who tried to do the right thing and got shut down for it. They deserve to understand the full shape of what shut them down. Silence on the line. "The investigation is ongoing," Vreeland said. "I can't disclose." "Tell them that an additional inquiry is open, that the clinical findings are one part of a larger picture, that their reports, their flags, their documentation, all of it contributed to something bigger than a hospital review." Emily paused. "You don't have to name Vess, just don't let them think it was only about one doctor." A long pause. "I'll consider it," Vreeland said, which from Vreeland meant yes. Emily ended the call and started drafting the supplemental statement. The Harmon military complex situation was every bit as bad as the message had suggested. A training facility building had suffered a partial structural collapse during an early morning readiness exercise. A combination of deferred maintenance and a foundation issue that had been flagged in inspection reports and not addressed, which was its own institutional failure of a different kind. 37 personnel were involved. By the time Emily's helicopter landed on the base's flight line at 8:40 a.m., the base medical facility had already received 19 patients, was stabilizing 4 critical cases with resources designed to handle 2, and had declared an internal mass casualty protocol. Emily walked into organized desperation. The base surgeon, a major named Dr. Eli Turan, met her at the entrance with the controlled expression of a man who has been awake since 4 a.m. and is grateful for reinforcements and doesn't have time to express it properly. 2 crush injuries, both lower extremity, one with vascular compromise, he said, walking fast. 1 thoracic trauma, rib series, possible splenic laceration, waiting on imaging. 1 head injury, GCS 8 on arrival, currently 7, neurology is 40 minutes out. Emily was already moving, already cataloging the facility layout, already seeing the points where the system was strained, the supply station with 3 staff pulling from it simultaneously, the single imaging unit with a backup of 4 patients, the triage area where 2 nurses were managing what should be 6 nurses' workload. "Which of your crush cases has the vascular compromise?" she asked. "Bay 2. "That's my first stop," she said. "Who's your best OR tech?" "Sergeant Malone, Bay 3. "Pull her to Bay 2. I'm going to need her." Turan looked at her for exactly 1 second. The brief assessment of a physician evaluating whether to hand authority to someone he's met 45 seconds ago, and then said, "Done," and moved to make the call. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that had no narrative shape while it was happening. It was just the work. The vascular compromise managed, the splenic laceration confirmed, and taken to the OR. The head injury stabilized until neurology arrived. There were 3 more moderate cases that needed specific interventions. A medication error caught and corrected before it reached the patient. A piece of equipment that failed and required an improvised solution. She got lunch wrong. She grabbed a protein bar from a supply cabinet at noon and ate half of it and put the other half in her pocket and forgot about it. She noticed her hands were steadier than they'd been at 6:30 a.m. in Harlow Falls, which was counterintuitive but wasn't. This kind of acute work was what her nervous system had been calibrated for, and it ran cleaner here than it had in 2 weeks of embedded evaluation. At 12:40 p.m., Turan found her in the corridor between the imaging unit and Bay 6. "The critical 4 are all stable," he said. He said it the way you said something you'd been afraid to say for 4 hours and were now permitted to say. "The crush injury in Bay 2 is going to need a vascular surgery consult from your regional medical center," Emily said. "The repair held, but it's not permanent. Already requested, they're sending someone by 1500. The head injury, neurology is with her now. GCS is back to 9. Emily let herself exhale. "Okay." Turan looked at her. He was in his early 40s, steady-eyed, with the particular quality of military physicians who have learned to absorb the distance between what medicine can do and what situations require without breaking down about the gap. "You're Voss," he said. "The evaluator." "Yes. I got a communication this morning from Medsocom." He said it without inflection, just delivering the information. "About Harlow Falls." Emily looked at him. "It said the evaluation is concluded," he said, "and that the findings were, they used the word significant." "That's accurate." "I've heard your name before," he said. "Not in connection with Harlow Falls, before that." He paused. "Fort Allen, 2021. Emily recognized the name. A field hospital in a forward operating zone where a supply chain failure had left the surgical unit without critical blood products for 62 hours. Emily had been the evaluator who'd identified the failure in the logistics chain and the field officer who'd improvised the solution. 14 patients had needed intervention during those 62 hours. All 14 had survived. "I wasn't there," she said. Her standard answer for situations she wasn't supposed to confirm. Turan nodded. He understood the answer. "Then whoever was there," he said carefully, "I'm glad they came here today." Emily picked up the next chart from the stack on the mobile station. "The vascular case," she said. "His compartment pressures need to be checked hourly until the regional consult gets here. Set a nurse timer. Don't leave it to memory." "I'll do it myself," Turan said. "Good," she said, and moved on. At 2 p.m., in a conference room at Meridian General 400 miles south, Vreeland stood at the head of a table that had been set up to accommodate every senior clinical and administrative staff member in the hospital. 61 people. The room held 61 people, and Gerald Park had opened every available chair and borrowed 4 from the conference suite next door, and still the back wall was lined with people standing. Vreeland had given briefings of this type before. She had given them after field investigations, after institutional failures, after the specific kind of situation where the people in the room needed to understand that what they had experienced was not the ordinary difficulty of their profession, but a structured failure with identifiable causes and identifiable consequences. She had given these briefings, and she had learned that what people needed most was not reassurance and not condemnation, but the specific relief of having the thing named, the shape of what they'd been inside made visible, so that the confusion they'd felt working in it was legitimized rather than dismissed. She stood at the front of the room and named it. She talked for 40 minutes. She described the clinical findings without softening them. She described the flag suppression pattern with specific numbers. She described Arthur Dean because he had to be described, because the people in this room deserved to know that their institution had experienced that failure and that it mattered. She described the administrative queue, manipulation, and its consequences for the nurses and residents and PAs whose reports had disappeared. When she reached the evaluation itself, she described it accurately. A classified federal assessment conducted by an embedded military medical officer whose credentials and training went substantially beyond what her cover role had suggested. She did not use the word spy. She used covert evaluator, which was the correct term, and also landed in the room with significant weight. She described the tamponade intervention in the trauma bay with clinical specificity and watched the room respond to the description of what had nearly happened to the patient and what had actually happened instead. She watched Renata, the scrub tech, look at the table and then look up again with the expression of someone who had already known this and was now watching others learn it. She watched Preston Okafor, who had come off a 30-hour stretch and was sitting in the second row with his arms crossed and his eyes steady. Then she said before she finished, there was an additional inquiry ongoing, federal, separate from the clinical review. She could not discuss the details. What she could say was that the clinical documentation generated by this staff, the flags, the reports, the notes and revision histories, the testimony given last night, had contributed to something larger than a hospital review. Their work had mattered, all of it, including the work that had been suppressed, which was now part of a federal record that would not be suppressed. She looked at the room. Dr. Thorne's clinical privileges have been suspended by the Medical Executive Committee, effective as of this morning, she said. The suspension is pending a full hearing before the State Medical Board, which has been notified and is conducting its own concurrent review. The room was very quiet. Donna Price will serve as interim charge nurse for the surgical and trauma units during the administrative transition. She has agreed to this role and has been briefed on the scope of the governance reforms that will be implemented under the monitoring arrangement. Donna, in the third row, did not look up. She was looking at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up. She looked at the room with the expression of someone who has decided all the way, and there is nothing equivocal left in the decision. The 2 nurses who filed clinical reports that were suppressed, Vreeland said, will be notified individually after this meeting that their reports are now in the federal record and that formal acknowledgement of their clinical accuracy will be included in the investigation findings. She paused. Their names will not be stated in this room without their consent, but they are in this room. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman in her late 30s made a sound that was not quite crying and then recovered it, and nobody looked at her because everyone in the immediate vicinity understood that looking was the wrong thing to do. Questions, Vreeland said, can be directed to me or to the administrative transition team. We will be here through the end of the week. She sat down. Gerald Park, to his credit, said nothing. He sat at the side of the room and looked at the table with the expression of a man who was already, in his head, writing the governance restructuring proposal that he understood was now the primary condition of his continued employment. At 3:15 p.m., Marcus Thorne's attorney, Raymond Kell, received a call from the Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Inspector General's office. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Raymond called Thorne. Thorne was in his house. He had not returned to the hospital after leaving the previous night, which was technically still within the bounds of the administrative process, but was practically, as his licensing attorney had gently explained at 8 a.m., inadvisable. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and an untouched plate of toast that his wife had made, and then retreated from when she understood that the particular quality of the morning was not one that required her presence. His wife's name was Nadine. She was a radiologist, sharp and precise, and she had known, since Thorne had come home at midnight and sat at the table in his coat and not said anything for 20 minutes, that what was happening was not the kind of thing that resolved cleanly. She was in her study when Raymond called. Thorne answered. He listened. He listened for 6 of the 11 minutes without saying anything. He asked 3 questions in the remaining 5. The questions were specific and legal and procedural, and the answers to all 3 were versions of the same answer, which was that the scope of the investigation had expanded substantially beyond clinical negligence and administrative misconduct. When the call ended, Thorne sat at the table for a long time. Then he called to Nadine. She came to the kitchen doorway. She looked at him. At the cold coffee and the untouched toast and the phone on the table and the specific quality of his posture, which was the posture of a man who has been large in a room for a very long time and has just become considerably smaller. "I need to tell you something," he said. Nadine came into the kitchen. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "All of it," she said, not as a question. He looked at her, at a woman who had spent 23 years being married to someone she'd believed she understood. "All of it," he said. He told her. It took 40 minutes. Some of what he said she had suspected. Some of what he said landed in the kitchen like objects dropped from a height, and she listened to them land without flinching, because Nadine Thorne was, among other things, a woman who had trained herself to look at things directly. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "The consulting contract," she said. "Did you know what it was for?" "I knew what it was," he said. "I told myself it wasn't what it was. That's not the same as not knowing." "No," he said. "It's not." She stood up. She took his coffee cup to the counter and poured it out. She put the kettle on. She stood at the counter with her back to him for a moment, and her posture was the posture of someone doing the specific work of deciding what they believe about another person, which is not fast work and cannot be hurried. "You need to call Raymond back," she said, "and you need to tell him you're going to cooperate." Raymond's advice is, "Marcus." She turned around. Her face was not angry exactly. It was the face of a woman who has just had a large part of her life revised and is moving through it with the discipline of someone who does not have the option of falling apart. "The man is dead. Arthur Dean. He's dead, and his flag sat in your queue for 19 hours and you closed it." The kitchen was very quiet. "Call Raymond," she said. "Tell him you're cooperating." She turned back to the kettle. Thorne picked up his phone. The Harlan Vest situation broke publicly 4 days later. The Financial Crimes Unit moved quickly once the scope was confirmed. 4 institutions, 11 consulting contracts across a 6-year period, billing irregularities totaling a figure that the press release, when it finally came, described as substantial, which was the language federal agencies used when the actual number was large enough to be its own headline. Vest was taken into custody on a Wednesday morning at an airport, which suggested someone had information about his travel plans, which suggested the 6-hour window between the IG referral and Emily's message had been enough to do something she hadn't known about but was glad it happened. The arrest generated the kind of news cycle that financial crime usually generated, detailed in the financial press, summarized broadly in national outlets, processed regionally in each of the 4 cities where his firm's contracts had operated. In Harlow Falls, the Meridian General connection made it local front page. Emily was not in Harlow Falls when this happened. She had been at Harmon Military Complex through Thursday, working alongside Turan's team until the last of the mass casualty patients had been stabilized and transferred, and the immediate crisis was fully resolved. Then she had been at the Medsocom regional office for 2 days of debriefing, first on Harmon, then on Harlow Falls, then on the supplemental statement she'd filed regarding Vess and the connection she'd identified between the consulting contract timeline and the administrative record window. She was in a hotel in a city she'd never been to before, because the debriefing location was the debriefing location, and you didn't choose it, eating a room service sandwich and reading the Harlow Falls regional paper's online coverage on her laptop, when her phone rang. It was Donna. She had Donna's number because Donna had texted her, a single text, 2 days after Emily left, that had said, Farida Osei has been accepted into the trauma surgery fellowship she applied for. She wanted you to know. Emily had not known Farida had applied for a fellowship, and she had stared at the text for a long moment and then typed back, "Tell her congratulations," and had meant it with a completeness that she didn't often let herself express. "Donna," she said. "I'm watching the news," Donna said. She sounded like someone who has been watching news for several hours and has moved through several emotional registers and landed in one that doesn't have a clean name. "Vess, the arrest. I saw it." "Did you know? When you were here, did you know about him?" "Not when I arrived," Emily said. "I found out the morning I left." A pause. So the whole time, the evaluation wasn't just about Thorne. The evaluation was genuinely about clinical standards. What was underneath that? I didn't know about it until the last day. But you suspected something. Emily thought about this honestly. "I suspected the flag suppression was being maintained too consistently to be entirely natural," she said. "The pattern was too clean. One person's arrogance produces errors, inconsistencies, moments where the suppression fails. Thorne's queue was almost perfectly consistent for 17 months. That's not human sloppiness. That's system design." Donna was quiet for a moment. "Arthur Dean," she said. "Yes. His family has been notified about the flag, about what it documented." Donna's voice was careful. "The hospital's legal team is handling the contact. Gerald Park authorized a direct acknowledgement rather than waiting for litigation." Emily absorbed this. It was not enough. Nothing was enough for what had happened to Arthur Dean, but it was the right institutional response, and the right response mattered even when it couldn't undo the thing it was responding to. "Donna," she said, "how's the floor?" A small pause, and then Donna said something Emily hadn't expected. She laughed. A short, dry sound, the laugh of someone who has not found anything funny in a long time and has just found something that is fractionally almost funny. "Noisy," Donna said. "Everyone's talking. The nurses who had their reports suppressed, one of them came to me yesterday and asked if she could resubmit her original flag as a formal clinical note in the patient's permanent record. She wanted it to exist correctly." A pause. "I said yes. We did it together." Emily looked at the window of her hotel room. The curtains were half open, the city outside ordinary and busy and indifferent. "That's good," she said. "That's exactly right." "Preston Okafor is asking about the military nursing pathway," Donna said. "He wants to know who he'd talk to. I told him I didn't know. He said—" She paused. "He said, whoever it is, he wants to do what you do." Emily was quiet for a moment. "He should talk to the Medsocom recruitment office," she said. "I'll send you the contact." "He'll be pleased," Donna said. Then, "Emily, the plaque." "What plaque?" "The hospital board voted this morning, part of the reform package. They're putting up a plaque in the ER, honoring the staff who came forward, who filed reports, who gave testimony, who—" She stopped. "They want to include your name." The hotel room was very quiet. "Don't," Emily said. "Emily, I'm serious, Donna. Don't put my name on it. The people whose names should be on it are the ones who stayed. Renata, Preston, Farida, the two nurses who filed the reports. The people who had everything to lose by telling the truth in that institution and did it anyway." She paused. "I came in from outside with a federal mandate and credentials nobody knew about. That's different. That's not the same kind of courage." A long silence. "I'll tell them what you said," Donna said. "Tell them to put it in a place patients can read it," Emily said. "Not a back corridor somewhere. Somewhere the patients are." "I will." Emily looked at the curtains, at the half-light of a city evening coming through the gap between them. "How's Wallace Greer?" she asked. "Home," Donna said. "Full recovery. He sent a card to the floor. It said—" She stopped, and there was something in her voice that was not quite under control. It said thank you to the nurse who looked at him instead of his chart. Emily didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. "Take care of yourself," Donna said quietly. And then, in the tone of someone delivering a thing they've been carrying for a while, "For what it's worth, I've worked with a lot of people in 28 years. I've worked alongside people who were technically good, And people who genuinely cared and occasionally people who were both. She paused. You're both. And I didn't say that when I should have. You said it now, Emily said. The call ended. Emily set the phone down on the bed beside her and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the plaque, about not wanting her name on it, about the specific discomfort of recognition from people who had not seen you clearly until an external force made them look, and the complicated question of what that recognition was worth and what you did with it. She thought it was worth something. She also thought it was not the point. She thought, the two nurses who resubmitted their flags, Farida's 8 pages, Preston asking about the military pathway, Wallace Greer's card. Those were the points. Those were the things that meant the institution was not going to return exactly to what it had been. And imperfect and slow and incomplete as change always was, those things were real. She finished the sandwich and opened her laptop to the secure channel. There was a message from Vreeland marked non-urgent, which meant Emily could read it when she was ready rather than immediately, which was Vreeland's version of consideration. She opened it. The message was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was administrative, the formal conclusion documentation for the Meridian General Evaluation, the Harmon Complex Action Report, the combined record that would go into Emily's service file. The second paragraph was not administrative. It said, effective in 30 days, a new evaluation assignment has been authorized. The facility is a federal research hospital in a mid-Atlantic state. Duration: 30 to 90 days, cover identity already established. Briefing package attached. Read at your discretion. You have 30 days. Also, take at least 1 week before you open it. That's an order, not a suggestion. Emily read the second paragraph twice. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't require an audience, the kind that happens when someone who has been doing difficult things in difficult places for a long time receives, unexpectedly, a piece of evidence that the person they work for sees them clearly. She closed the laptop. She did not open the briefing package. She looked at the curtains and the light coming through them and thought about 30 days, which was more time than she usually had between assignments, and about what a person did with 30 days when they had been moving for as long as she had been moving, and stillness was its own kind of challenge. She thought, I'll figure it out. She leaned back against the headboard and let herself be, for exactly this moment, a person in a hotel room who had done the work and was allowed to rest. Then her phone buzzed on the bed beside her. Unknown number. No message. Just a missed call notification with a callback number she didn't recognize. Not a government prefix, not a number that matched anything in her contacts. She picked up the phone and looked at it. The area code was from Harlow Falls. She thought about who in Harlow Falls had her personal number. Vreeland had a different number. Donna had the number Emily had texted from, which was a secure line, not this one. Preston Okafor didn't have any number. The investigators used official channels. The only person in Harlow Falls who might have found this number through a chain of contacts she hadn't controlled was someone who had been motivated to look for it and had the resources to find it. She checked the time of the missed call. 23 minutes ago, while she'd been on the phone with Donna. She looked at the number. She called it back. It rang twice. Then a voice she didn't recognize said, Ms. Voss, my name is Aldrich Pham. I'm a journalist with the Federal Health Accountability Network. I've been covering the Meridian General investigation since this morning. A pause. I know who you are. I mean, I know what you actually are, not the cover. Another pause. And I know about the other 3 facilities, and I know about Vess. His voice was careful and specific, not aggressive. The voice of someone who has information and is deciding what to do with it, and has chosen the direct approach. I'd like to talk to you before I publish. Emily sat very still. I think, Pham said, that you'd prefer to know what's going in print before it does. And I think there are things I don't have that would change the shape of the story. He paused. I'm not trying to burn you. I'm trying to get it right. The hotel room was quiet. Emily thought about 30 days. About the briefing package on her laptop she hadn't opened. About the Mid-Atlantic Research Hospital, whose name she didn't know yet. Where cover identity was already established. Where she would arrive as someone no one had heard of. She thought about a journalist who had her personal number and the names of 4 facilities and the name Harlan Vess and the phrase, "what you actually are." She thought, how much does he have? She thought, how much more can he get? "Mr. Pham," she said. "Yes." "Where are you?" "Currently, I'm in Harlow Falls. I've been here since the arrest." A pause. "But I can be wherever you are by tomorrow morning." Emily looked at the curtain, at the light. She thought about the evaluation that hadn't been just an evaluation, about the financial architecture underneath the clinical failure, about Harlan Vess in custody and 4 facilities with his consulting contracts, and the question of whether 4 was actually the number or whether 4 was simply the number they'd found so far. She thought about a story that was, if this journalist had what he said he had, going to be published whether she talked to him or not. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "is not going to work." "When does work?" She looked at the phone, at the unknown number from Harlow Falls. "I'll call you," she said. She ended the call. She set the phone down. She sat with the specific weight of a situation that she had believed 40 minutes ago was concluded and had just revealed itself to be something else. Not concluded, but in transition, moving into a shape she hadn't anticipated, with variables she hadn't controlled. A journalist, with her number. She picked up the secure tablet and typed a message to Vreeland. "We have a problem. Call when you can." She set the tablet down. She looked at the laptop, at the closed briefing package, at the 30 days Vreeland had told her to take. She thought, the week off is going to have to wait. Vreeland called back in 11 minutes. Emily had used those 11 minutes to pull up everything she could access on Aldrich Pham through the secure channel, his publication history, his professional record, the Federal Health Accountability Network's editorial track. What she found was not reassuring and was not alarming. It was the profile of a journalist who was genuinely good at what he did, methodical, accurate, with a history of stories that were damaging to institutions because they were true, not because they were sensationalized. He had broken a story on a pharmaceutical billing fraud 2 years prior that had resulted in 3 federal indictments. He had spent 18 months on a Veterans Administration staffing scandal before publishing, and when he published, every fact held. He was not going to be managed. He was also not apparently reckless. When Vreeland called, Emily read her the summary in under 2 minutes. "He has the number of facilities," Vreeland said. "That's the problem. He has the name Vess. He has the connection between the consulting contracts and the clinical suppression. If he publishes without the full financial picture, the story becomes about one corrupt network, not about the systemic gap in oversight that allowed Vess to operate for 6 years. You're saying we give him the fuller picture. I'm saying we decide whether we'd rather have the story told accurately or have it told incompletely." Emily paused. "He's going to publish either way. He said so directly. He's not bluffing. His track record is not that of someone who bluffs." A silence on the line. "What does he want from you specifically?" Vreeland asked. "He wants to know what I am, what the evaluation program is. He has enough to understand that I'm not a standard civilian nurse and that the evaluation was not a standard clinical review. He wants the frame for the story. We can't give him the program." "I know. The evaluation methodology, the embedded structure, the specific command authorization, that's classified." "I know that too." Emily looked at the curtain. "But there's a version of this that's accurate and doesn't expose the program. The version where a federal medical officer was sent to assess a hospital and found clinical negligence and financial fraud and documented both." She paused. "That version is true. It's just incomplete. And Pham will know it's incomplete." "Yes, but if the parts he publishes are true and we give him enough to frame it accurately, the incomplete parts are his editorial choice, not his ignorance." Another silence. Longer. "Give him the clinical findings," Vreeland said finally. "The flag suppression, the Dean outcome, the tamponade intervention. Give him the Vess connection insofar as it relates to Meridian General specifically. Do not characterize the broader network. Let financial crimes manage that disclosure on their own timeline." "And my identity?" "You're a federal medical officer conducting an authorized evaluation. That's accurate and that's all he gets." A pause. "Emily, be careful with this one." "I know. He's good at his job. That means he's good at getting people to say more than they intended to." "So am I," Emily said. She could hear Vreeland deciding whether that was reassuring or not. Then, call me after. Emily ended the call and looked at Fam's number on her phone. She called him. He answered in one ring, which meant he'd been waiting. Mr. Pham, she said. Ms. Voss, thank you for calling back. I'll talk to you, not on the record tonight, background only. And there are boundaries I'll tell you up front, and I'll tell you why. And I'd like you to respect them. A pause. She could hear him thinking. That's fair, he said. Then tell me what you have, and I'll tell you what's accurate. And where I can't confirm something, I'll tell you why I can't, rather than just saying no comment. Another pause, shorter. Okay, he said. That works. They talked for 2 hours. Emily sat on the hotel bed with her back against the headboard and her notes open on the tablet and told him the truth in the dimensions she was authorized to tell it and held the rest with a firmness that was not hostility, just boundary. When he pushed, and he pushed carefully, the way a good reporter pushes, not aggressively but persistently, finding the edges, she told him what she couldn't give him and why. Once he said, off the record, just for my own understanding, the other 3 facilities, is this a pattern someone built or a pattern someone exploited? She thought about that. Off the record, she said. Both. Vess built the mechanism. The mechanism worked because the pattern of institutional vulnerability already existed. He didn't create the problem of hospitals that don't enforce their own accountability. He just figured out how to profit from it. A silence on the other end. That's the real story, Pham said. Isn't it? Yes, she said. It is. He published 6 days later. The story ran across 2 platforms, the Federal Health Accountability Network and a national health policy publication that had co-sponsorship. It was long, heavily documented, and structured exactly as Emily had hoped. Meridian General as the specific case, Harlan Vess as the financial architect, and in the final third, a broader analysis of the oversight gap that had allowed this kind of arrangement to operate across multiple institutions without detection. He quoted a federal medical officer who had requested anonymity for operational reasons. He described the embedded evaluation methodology in general terms that were accurate and did not expose the program. He described the tamponade intervention in the trauma bay with the clinical specificity of someone who had been briefed by a person who understood what they were describing. He wrote, the officer's actions in the trauma bay that afternoon were consistent with what an evaluation like this ultimately revealed. A single individual doing, precisely and without fanfare, the work that a broken institution had stopped doing for itself. Emily read that line twice. She thought it was slightly too neat, the kind of sentence that a good journalist wrote when they wanted to give a story shape. She also thought it was not inaccurate. The consequences arrived in stages, which is how consequences usually arrive. Harlan Vess was indicted on 11 counts of federal fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct federal medical oversight. The indictment named the 4 facilities, the 11 contracts, and the 6-year financial timeline. His attorney filed a motion to suppress the financial records, which was denied. His bail was set at a number that suggested the court shared the federal government's assessment of his flight risk. He was not granted the bail amount on the first attempt. Marcus Thorne appeared before the state medical board 32 days after his clinical privileges were suspended at Meridian General. The hearing lasted 2 days. Emily was not present. She submitted her documented testimony in writing, which the board accepted as formal evidence. Donna Price testified in person. So did Renata. So did Farida Osei, whose 8 pages of written statement had been, the board's investigative counsel later noted, among the most detailed and credible pieces of voluntary witness documentation they had received in a physician misconduct case. The board's findings were released 3 weeks after the hearing concluded. Marcus Thorne's medical license was revoked. Not suspended, revoked. The distinction mattered. Suspension had a defined period, a possible path back. Revocation was the board's statement that the conduct in question, taken in full, represented a pattern of behavior that removed the professional trust that a medical license required. The Arthur Dean finding was cited specifically. The finding noted that the delay in responding to a clinical flag filed on a patient who subsequently died represented negligence that could not be attributed to individual error or capacity constraint, but was instead part of a documented systematic practice. Thorne's attorney Raymond Kell had filed a motion requesting the board consider mitigating factors. The board had considered them. They revoked the license anyway. The malpractice insurer settled with the Dean family before the board's findings were released. The settlement amount was not disclosed, which was standard. What was not standard was that Gerald Park personally requested a meeting with the Dean family's attorney and attended it himself, without the hospital's legal counsel present, which his own attorneys advised against and which he did anyway. He told the family what had happened in plain language, and without the kind of institutional distancing language that made settlements feel like a bureaucratic transaction rather than an acknowledgement of a human being. It did not give the Dean family their father back. Nothing could. But it was not nothing either. Linda Vosh, the evening charge nurse who had been part of the management layer that had enabled the floor's culture of suppression, she had not been named in the federal findings directly, but the internal review conducted by Meridian General's Reform Committee reached its own conclusions. She resigned before the committee completed its report. The committee noted her resignation and completed the report anyway, because the findings needed to exist in the institutional record regardless of whether she was still there to receive them. The two nurses whose reports had been suppressed were both offered formal written apologies from the hospital's board of directors. One of them, a woman named Carrie Nolan, who had been on the surgical floor for 6 years, was offered the staff clinical quality coordinator position that had been created as part of the reform package. She took it. The other nurse, a man named Breck Salter, who had filed his report and then spent 4 months quietly updating his resume and considering whether to leave nursing entirely, came to Donna Price one morning and asked if the position of charge nurse on the evening trauma shift was going to be posted externally or filled internally. Donna said it was going to be posted, but that internal candidates were encouraged. Breck Salter applied. He was well qualified. He got the position. The first thing he did in his new role was revise the incident reporting protocol so that clinical flags went simultaneously to 3 separate administrative channels: the attending, the charge nurse, and the quality coordinator, instead of routing through a single physician's queue. Donna reviewed the revision and signed off on it in under an hour. 7. Emily received the formal notification of her evaluation record 6 weeks after leaving Harlow Falls. She was between assignments. The week off Vreeland had ordered had stretched into 3 weeks because the Mid-Atlantic assignment had been delayed for reasons that had nothing to do with Emily and everything to do with the facility's own restructuring timeline, which had shifted when the federal oversight publication that had run FAM's story subsequently published a follow-up piece on the oversight gap more broadly, prompting 3 other institutions to request voluntary compliance reviews before they received mandated ones. The voluntary review requests were an outcome nobody had planned for, and almost everyone considered a good sign. Emily spent the 3 weeks in a rented cottage near the coast, not because it was romantic or because she needed the symbolism of water and open space, but because Vreeland's exact words had been, "Take time before you open the briefing," and Emily needed an environment where there was genuinely nothing urgent to respond to. Because in any urban setting, she would manufacture urgency out of the ambient noise and defeat the purpose. The cottage was in a small town called Pelter Cove. It was quiet and cold and smelled like brine and old wood. She ran in the mornings, which she always intended to do and rarely managed during assignments. She read 3 books she'd been carrying in her bag for 8 months. She called her sister twice, which was 2 times more than she usually called during an active operational period, and about 5 times fewer than her sister would have preferred. But it was something. She thought about Meridian General. Not obsessively. She had learned a long time ago that obsessive retrospection was as much a performance as it was a coping mechanism, a way of feeling like you were doing something when you were actually just doing something to yourself. She thought about it the way you think about anything important that is over, with attention, not rumination, turning it in the light to see what it actually was. What it was, she had concluded, was not a story about a bad hospital or a bad doctor. Those stories were simpler and less interesting than this one. This was a story about the specific accumulation of small decisions. Donna choosing silence for 14 years, the board never looking closely at the metrics, Thorne deciding the flags were other people's overcaution, administrators evaluating certification processes without asking the right questions about clinical culture, that aggregated into something that killed Arthur Dean and very nearly killed Daniel Morrow, and had probably caused harm in between that nobody had fully documented yet. None of those small decisions had been made by people who thought of themselves as bad actors. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that made it harder and more important than a simple narrative about villains. Thorne had believed he was good at his job. He had been good at his job in the ways that were visible and measurable and flattering. He had been catastrophically bad at the parts of his job that required him to be uncertain, to hold the possibility that a nurse he hadn't credited knew something he didn't, to let a flag sit in his queue long enough to actually read it. His certainty had been a kind of arrogance, but it had also been the specific institutional product of 9 years of operating in an environment where his certainty was never seriously challenged. Institutions made people. People made institutions. It went both directions, and the arrow of causation ran simultaneously in both. And the only thing that interrupted the cycle was accountability. External when internal failed, documented when verbal was insufficient, persistent when the first effort was suppressed. She had been the accountability. She had done the work. And she knew, with the kind of knowledge that comes not from confidence, but from experience, that it was not enough on its own. The accountability had to become structural, had to change the environment that had produced the problem, or the next person who came in and saw something wrong would face the same wall she'd walked into on day one. Breck Salter's triple-channel flag protocol was structural. Carrie Nolan's quality coordinator position was structural. The federal monitoring arrangement was structural. The reforms were imperfect and incomplete and would require sustained attention for years. She was not going to be there to provide that attention. She was going to be somewhere else, in a different hospital, with a different cover and a different set of problems. That was also structural. That was, in fact, the whole point. The formal evaluation record arrived in the secure channel on a Tuesday morning. It was standard documentation, the official form, the performance assessment, the mission outcome summary. She had received versions of this document after every evaluation. They were typically professional and precise, and completely devoid of anything that reflected the actual texture of what the work had been. This one had a handwritten addition at the bottom of the last page. Vreeland's handwriting, which Emily recognized from field communications going back several years. It said, "The record will reflect standard mission completion. What the record cannot reflect is that this outcome was not standard. You know the difference, so do I." Emily sat with that for a moment in the cottage kitchen, with coffee going cold in her hand and the sound of the ocean coming through the window she'd cracked open despite the temperature because she liked the sound. She thought about what the record could reflect and what it couldn't. The record would reflect evaluation conducted, findings documented, clinical standards violations confirmed, federal certification suspended, financial fraud investigation initiated, licensing consequences completed. What the record could not reflect, the specific quality of Donna Price's voice when she'd stopped in the doorway and said, "You're good at it." Renata putting the syringe in her hand without being asked. Preston Okafor asking if it was going to change, and the fact that the answer had turned out to be yes. Daniel Morrow, looking at the ceiling with the mild, wondering expression of a man who had recently been somewhere else and was glad to be back. The record could not reflect the fact that at 3:09 p.m. on a February afternoon, a line had been drawn through Emily's clinical notation in a patient's chart by a physician who believed that his authority was sufficient to overwrite her judgment, and that the line had not worked, because the revision history existed, and she had known it existed and had built the entire evidentiary structure of 2 weeks of work around the simple fact that crossed-out things still happened. That you could draw a line through someone's words, but you could not draw a line through what the words had recorded. That the truth, documented and specific and routed through channels that could not all be closed simultaneously, had a persistence that arrogance did not. She finished the cold coffee and went for her run. 3 days before the Mid-Atlantic assignment began, Emily received a package at the cottage's mail address, the secure drop address Vreeland's office used for physical correspondence. Inside was a single printed photograph. No accompanying note, no sender identification beyond the Medsocom address on the outer envelope. The photograph was of the plaque in the emergency department at Meridian General. It was mounted, she could see, on the wall at the entrance to the main ER. Not a corridor, not a back hallway, exactly where she had asked Donna to put it, in a place where patients could read it. The plaque read, "In recognition of the staff of this emergency department, who documented the truth when doing so required courage. and of the patient whose life was saved because someone in this room refused to stop trying. Meridian General Emergency Department. Staff of record, 2024 to 2025. 5 names followed. Carrie Nolan, Breck Salter, Renata Vidal, Preston Okafor, Farida Osei. Emily's name was not on it. She had asked for that. She had meant the asking. And she looked at the 5 names on the photograph and felt something that was not absence, but its opposite. The specific fullness of having set something in motion and seen it land correctly, in the right hands, producing the right names on the right wall. She put the photograph in her bag, not in the tablet sleeve, not in the folder with operational documents. In the front pocket of the bag, the one she reached into 30 times a day for minor things, where it would be reachable by accident, which meant she would see it without deciding to. The Mid-Atlantic assignment began on a Thursday in early April. New badge, new name, new hospital, with its own specific smell and its own specific sounds and its own specific accumulation of the things that were working and the things that weren't, waiting to be seen by someone with the patience to look. Emily walked through the entrance of the facility at 7 a.m. as a woman named Sarah Marsh, travel nurse, 3-month contract, trauma, and surgical floor. The charge nurse looked up from the scheduling board. Brief assessment. New face, unremarkable presentation, the slightly tentative posture of someone finding their footing in a new environment. Marsh, the charge nurse said. Yes, Emily said. First day. The charge nurse handed her an orientation packet. Emily took it. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, long enough to have the layout and the staffing structure and the unit protocols in her head, and then she set it on the counter. She picked up the first chart on the stack. She started her rounds. There are people in the world who do their work quietly and without announcement, who do not require the recognition of the room to know that the thing they're doing is worth doing. They walk into broken places and they look at what is broken with clear eyes, and they begin, methodically and without drama, the work of documenting what is true. They are not superheroes. They are not perfect. They get tired and they eat sandwiches in cars, and they have sisters they don't call enough, and they make calls in the back of helicopters that don't all go the way they planned. They are simply people who decided, at some point, that the line between what they could do and what they would do was not one they were willing to let someone else draw. That decision is the whole thing. Everything else is the work. Emily walked the 3rd-floor trauma corridor on a Thursday morning in April and looked at the unit with the particular attention of someone who had learned that the truth of a place was in its small details. The medication cart, the scheduling board, the supply closet, the revision histories that nobody thought to hide because nobody thought anyone would look. She was going to look. She always looked. The people who had dismissed her, who had drawn lines through her words and told her to stay in her lane and believed that authority was the same thing as being right, they had lost everything they thought that authority protected. Not because someone punished them, though consequences had come. Because authority without accountability is a structure built on a surface that shifts, and when it shifts, the structure has nothing underneath it. Emily Voss had something underneath her. She had the work, and the work was beginning again, here, in a new corridor, under a different name, on a morning that looked ordinary and wasn't. She opened the first chart. She read it the way she read everything, fully, looking at what was there and what was missing, paying attention to the gap between the two. She turned the page. She began.